Picture standing atop a windswept tower, gazing across a landscape cloaked in mist and moonlight. Below, an ancient stone castle rises from the fog, its turrets piercing a sky alive with unfamiliar constellations. This is the world of the Middle Ages, a time when every shadow held a story, every whispered rumor carried the weight of divine mystery, and the line between the earthly and the spiritual felt as thin as parchment. In an age without electric light or scientific explanation, humanity's deepest fears and highest hopes took shape in tales passed down through generations, tales that form the very heart of the 35 legendary myths of the spiritual world. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were attempts to make sense of a universe that often felt unpredictable and mysterious. Imagine living in a village where a sudden illness might be blamed on a vengeful spirit, or where the appearance of a comet could be interpreted as a divine omen. In this world, ancient pagan traditions honoring spirits of the forest, river, and hearth slowly intertwined with the rituals and beliefs of Christianity, creating a unique fusion of faith and folklore. From haunted abbeys to encounters with otherworldly beings, these legends offered comfort, warning, and wonder to those who shared them. They were the framework through which ordinary people interpreted miracles, curses, and everything in between. Today, we're about to step back into that world of torchlight and twilight, where belief shaped reality and the supernatural felt vividly close. We'll uncover stories of spectral monks, cursed relics, and celestial visions. Myths so powerful they've endured for centuries, capturing our imagination even now. Whether you're drawn to history, mystery, or the timeless human quest for meaning, this journey through medieval spiritual lore promises to awaken your sense of wonder. So settle in, open your mind, and join me as we explore the shadows and light of an era when the unseen felt profoundly real. Among these enduring legends, few capture the essence of spiritual quest quite like the myth of the Holy Grail. This wasn't just a story about a lost treasure, it was a profound metaphor for the human soul's yearning for divine connection. The legend tells of a simple cup, a vessel used by Christ during the Last Supper. According to lore, it was later used to collect his blood at the crucifixion, infusing this ordinary object with unimaginable holy power. It was said that merely gazing upon the Grail could heal the sick, restore the land, and grant eternal life. But more than that, it offered a direct glimpse into the divine, a chance to witness God's grace made manifest on earth. This spiritual potency made the Grail the ultimate object of desire in medieval tales, particularly those of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Their quest for the relic was never a simple treasure hunt. It was the highest test of character, faith, and purity. Ordinary knights, no matter how strong or brave, could never hope to find it. The quest demanded a perfect heart. We see this in the stories of Sir Percival, a knight whose innocence and unwavering faith allowed him to catch a fleeting glimpse of the Grail, and Sir Galahad, often portrayed as the ideal of chivalric virtue, the only knight considered pure enough to actually achieve the Grail and ascend to heaven. Their journeys were filled with moral tests, rescuing maidens, resisting temptation, showing compassion to enemies, each one a step toward spiritual refinement. What's fascinating is how the Grail's story evolved, blending strict Christian symbolism with older, magical traditions. In some versions, it's not just a cup but a stone that fell from heaven, providing food and drink to the worthy, a clear echo of pagan cornucopias or magical cauldrons of plenty from Celtic myths. This fusion shows how medieval audiences understood spirituality. It was a tapestry woven from many threads where the divine could express itself through both miracle and magic. The Grail became a symbol that could hold multiple meanings at once, a Christian relic, a source of life, and a mirror that reflected the true nature of anyone who sought it. This legendary quest resonates so deeply because it speaks to a universal truth. The search for the Grail is the search for meaning, for purpose, for something greater than ourselves. It reminds us that the most valuable journeys are not about the destination, but about who we become along the way. The knights who failed still found honor in their striving, their character forged in the pursuit of something holy. In a world that often felt dark and uncertain, the Grail offered a story of hope, that purity and perseverance could lead one to the ultimate source of light and life. While the quest for the Holy Grail was a test of faith and purity, another legendary object promised a different kind of mastery, not just over the soul, but over the very fabric of nature itself. This was the Philosopher's Stone, the ultimate prize in the ancient art of alchemy. To the medieval mind, this was no mere legend. It was a scientific and spiritual pursuit that consumed some of the greatest thinkers of the age. They believed this mysterious substance could perform two miraculous feats: the transmutation of base metals like lead into pure, precious gold, and the creation of the elixir of life, a potion granting immortality and eternal youth. It was the dream of ultimate power and perfection, a tangible key to unlocking the deepest secrets of the universe. The search for the stone was a global endeavor, stretching from the laboratories of European monks to the libraries of Islamic scholars. In the Islamic world, figures like Jabir ibn Hayyan laid much of the groundwork for alchemy, viewing their work as a sacred science that blended chemistry with spiritual philosophy. Their knowledge eventually filtered into Europe, where it took root in the minds of Christian alchemists. These weren't just eccentric hermits mixing potions. Many were devout intellectuals who saw their work as a form of divine worship. They operated in a world where the material and the spiritual were deeply intertwined. To transform a dull, imperfect metal into shining gold was seen as a physical act of redemption, a mirror of how divine grace could transform a sinful human soul into a perfected being. This process was shrouded in symbolic language and cryptic imagery, often described as the magnum opus or great work. Alchemists wrote of a series of stages often symbolized by colors like black, white, and red that represented both a chemical process and a spiritual journey. The initial stage, nigredo or blackening, stood for death and decay, the breaking down of the base material. This was followed by albedo, whitening, a purification that represented enlightenment. The final stage, rubedo or reddening, achieved the creation of the stone, symbolizing unity with the divine and the achievement of the highest wisdom. These steps were a metaphor for the alchemist's own path, through suffering, purification, and ultimately spiritual rebirth. What makes the myth of the Philosopher's Stone so compelling is its dual nature. On one hand, it was a literal pursuit that drove centuries of experimentation, leading to genuine scientific discoveries in chemistry and medicine. The methods and equipment developed by alchemists became the foundation of modern lab science. On the other hand, it was always a profound spiritual allegory. The stone was never just an object. It represented the quest for inner perfection, the hope that humanity could evolve beyond its flawed state. In a time of short lifespans and material scarcity, the stone was a powerful symbol of humanity's desire to overcome its limitations, to conquer death, poverty, and the imperfections of the natural world. It was a testament to the medieval belief that to understand the secrets of matter was to come one step closer to understanding the mind of God. For all its brilliance and transformative promise, the Philosopher's Stone was ultimately an instrument, a means to an end. And for many, that ultimate end was not untold wealth, but something far more personal, the desire to cheat death itself. This deep human yearning gave rise to one of the most persistent and intimate legends of the spiritual world, the myth of the elixir of life. Unlike the distant, almost abstract quest for the Grail or the complex laboratory work for the stone, the search for the elixir was profoundly visceral. It was a dream of perpetual youth, of vitality that never faded, of watching generations come and go while one remained unchanged. This was not just a fantasy for kings and emperors. It was a hope that lived in the heart of every person who ever felt the first ache of age or witnessed a loved one grow frail. The imagined recipes for this miraculous potion were as varied as the cultures that dreamed of it. In the vast herbal knowledge of medieval monasteries, monks meticulously transcribed ancient texts describing fantastical plants and minerals. Some recipes called for ingredients like the mythical herb of immortality, often thought to grow in inaccessible, sacred places like the highest peaks of the Himalayas or a hidden valley in the Orient. Others spoke of a mysterious substance known as viriditas, a green life force said to be found in the morning dew collected from specific plants under the light of a full moon. These formulas blended practical botanical knowledge with deep spiritual symbolism, reflecting a belief that the natural world was infused with divine energy that could be harnessed by those who knew its secrets. Yet for the true alchemist, the pursuit was never solely about mixing physical ingredients. The search for the elixir was inextricably linked to a parallel process of spiritual refinement. Many alchemical texts are deliberately obscure, speaking in allegories that suggest the true elixir was not a liquid in a flask but a state of being. To achieve immortality, one first had to purify the soul, to align one's inner spirit with the harmonious cycles of the cosmos. This concept, often drawn from Taoist and Hermetic traditions that filtered into medieval Europe, proposed that longevity was the natural result of a balanced life. Practices like meditation, breathing exercises, and ethical living were seen as crucial steps in distilling one's own vital essence, transforming the base self into a perfected, eternal entity. The physical potion, if it existed, was merely the outer manifestation of this profound inner transformation. This dual path, the material and the spiritual, highlights the rich complexity of medieval thought. It was a time when a recipe could simultaneously be a list of herbs and a set of prayers, when a laboratory procedure for distillation mirrored the soul's ascent to God. The legend of the elixir of life endures because it speaks to a tension we still feel today: the desire for a technological fix for aging versus the understanding that a meaningful life is about more than just adding years. It reminds us that the most potent elixirs might not be found in a bottle, but in the way we choose to live, connecting with the world and finding harmony within ourselves. Yet the power of a sword, even one as legendary as Excalibur, is only as strong as the hand that wields it. This medieval understanding of power being conditional on virtue is perhaps best illustrated by another magical object from the Arthurian cycle: the sword placed within an anvil atop a stone. The tale begins not with a mighty king, but in a time of crisis and political chaos following the death of King Uther Pendragon. With no clear heir, the kingdom teetered on the brink of collapse, and the leading lords of the land could agree on nothing. It was in this power vacuum that a miraculous sight appeared: a great block of stone, sometimes described as marble or lodestone, into which an anvil had been thrust, and buried deep within that anvil was the gleaming blade of a sword. Inscribed upon it were words that promised a divine solution, that whoever could pull this sword from the stone was the rightful king of all England. This was no test of brute strength, though many a powerful knight would later strain against the blade to no avail. This was a test of legitimacy, a public demonstration of divine will. The myth captures a core medieval political belief that true sovereignty was not taken by force or voted upon, but was instead a sacred quality bestowed by God. The sword acted as a divine selector, a supernatural mechanism that could see into the very soul of a person and recognize the qualities of a true leader: justice, piety, and a pure heart. When the young Arthur, then a mere squire serving his foster brother, effortlessly drew the sword to replace a sword lost in a tournament, it was not because he was the strongest, but because he was the only one who was meant to. His act was one of innocent practicality, not ambition, which only further proved his worthiness in the eyes of the divine. Excalibur itself, often conflated with the sword in the stone, but in many traditions a separate weapon given to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake, shares this connection to the other world. This blade was more than just unbreakable. Its scabbard was said to possess the magical property of preventing its bearer from losing any blood, making the king virtually invincible in battle. This intertwining of spiritual right and physical protection was crucial. It meant that a rightful king, chosen by the divine, would be supernaturally supported in his duty to protect and guide his people. The sword was a symbol of his sacred duty to dispense justice and defend the realm, while the scabbard represented his role as a protector, a shield for his subjects. To lose one, as Arthur eventually did, was to unravel the very fabric of his ordained kingship. These stories of divine selection resonated so powerfully because they addressed a deep-seated anxiety in the feudal world. In an era of rampant warfare, political assassination, and disputed successions, the idea that a higher power could intervene to clearly mark the rightful ruler was a comforting one. It was a myth that provided social stability, suggesting that the established order was not just a matter of human convention but part of a celestial plan. The sword in the stone was the ultimate anti-usurper device, a guarantee that the man-crowned king carried with him the undeniable endorsement of heaven itself, a legitimacy that no rival could ever hope to challenge. But if the sword in the stone was a definitive test of divine right, the challenge presented by the Green Knight was something far more complex, a test not of a king's legitimacy but of a knight's inner virtue. This myth introduces one of the most unsettling and unforgettable figures in all of Arthurian legend. The story unfolds during a lavish Christmas feast at Camelot, a celebration of warmth, light, and Christian fellowship. Into this civilized gathering erupts a figure of pure, untamed nature. He is a giant of a man, entirely green. His skin, his hair, his clothes, even his horse is the color of deep moss and fresh holly. In one hand he holds a colossal axe, in the other a simple holly branch, a symbol of peace. This impossible being, both terrifying and magnificent, issues a direct challenge to the pride of the Round Table, the Christmas game. The rules of his game are as bizarre as his appearance. He will allow any brave knight to strike him once with his own giant axe, on the condition that in 1 year's time, that knight must journey to the Green Chapel and receive an identical blow in return. It is a test of raw courage and, more importantly, a test of honor. The entire court is stunned into silence, their festive mood shattered by this supernatural intrusion. It is the young Sir Gawain, Arthur's nephew, who finally steps forward to accept the challenge, and with one swift blow, he cleanly severs the Green Knight's head from his shoulders. The court expects the test to be over, but in the most shocking moment of the tale, the Green Knight simply stands up, picks up his own head, and reminds Gawain of their appointment a year hence before riding away. This is not a creature bound by the natural laws of life and death. He is an ancient force, a manifestation of the eternal, cyclical power of nature itself. Gawain's subsequent quest to find the Green Chapel and uphold his end of the bargain is the heart of the story. It is a journey away from the safety and chivalry of court and into the raw, unforgiving wilderness of the human soul. The myth brilliantly blends pre-Christian symbolism with a clear Christian moral framework. The Green Knight himself is a classic vegetation deity, a figure from pagan lore like the Holly King or a nature spirit, representing the endless cycle of death in winter and rebirth in spring. His beheading and restoration mirror the annual decay and regrowth of the natural world. Yet, the test he administers is deeply concerned with Christian knightly virtues, courage, loyalty, and most importantly, truth. This fusion is perfected during Gawain's stay at a castle on his journey, where the Lord proposes a game of his own. He will go out hunting each day and give Gawain whatever he catches, and in exchange, Gawain will give him whatever he has received while staying in the castle. Each day, the Lord's wife attempts to seduce Gawain, and though he resists her advances, he accepts a few kisses which he dutifully passes on to her husband. On the third day, however, she also gives him a green girdle, a magical sash she promises will protect him from harm. Fearful of his impending encounter with the Green Knight, Gawain accepts it and crucially keeps it a secret, breaking his agreement with his host. This single act of fear-driven deceit is the crux of the entire moral test. When Gawain finally meets the Green Knight at the chapel, he flinches at the first swing of the axe, earning a reproach. He holds steady for the second, but the Green Knight only nicks his neck on the third blow, drawing a single drop of blood. The Green Knight then reveals himself to be Bertilac, the lord of the castle, and explains that the 3 blows corresponded to the 3 days of their exchange. The first 2 swings were for the 2 days where Gawain honestly passed on the kisses. The small cut was for the 3rd day, when he concealed the green girdle out of a very human desire to survive. Gawain is utterly shamed, feeling he has failed in his chivalric ideals, but the Green Knight, smiling, commends him. He explains that the entire ordeal was orchestrated by Morgan Le Fay to test the fame of Arthur's court, and that Gawain's small failing only proves his essential humanity. He passed the test of courage and loyalty but revealed a tiny flaw of fear, making him not a perfect, distant hero, but a relatable and truly virtuous man. Gawain returns to Camelot not in triumphal glory, but in humble wisdom, wearing the green girdle not as a trophy, but as a permanent reminder of his own fallibility and the constant effort required to live up to one's ideals. But even the most profound test of a single knight's honor pales before the sheer, apocalyptic terror of a myth that shook the very heavens, the Wild Hunt. Imagine a bitter winter's night. The wind howls and a sudden, unnatural silence falls over the countryside. Then, a distant sound begins to swell, a cacophony of baying hounds, blaring horns, and the thunder of countless hooves. People inside their huts would bar the doors and huddle by the fire, whispering a warning to their children, "Do not look outside," for to witness the hunt was to risk being swept away into the unknown. This was no earthly chase. This was a spectral procession of damned souls and supernatural beings, a furious army of the dead racing across the moonlit sky. The leader of this ghastly parade varied from region to region, a fascinating clue to how this myth evolved and was adopted across cultures. In the Germanic and Norse traditions, it was often the god Odin himself, known as Woden to the Anglo-Saxons, who led the charge. Riding his 8-legged steed Sleipnir, he was the All-Father, not in his wise aspect, but as a furious hunter gathering the souls of the fallen. In the British Isles, the role of leader was sometimes assigned to King Arthur, a tragic refraction of the once glorious king, now eternally roaming the skies with his knights, forever waiting for the call to return and save his kingdom. In Wales, it was Gwyn ap Nudd, the king of the Welsh otherworld Anon, who led the pack, and in some Christianized versions, the hunter was none other than the biblical Cain, cursed to wander forever, or even the figure of the devil. This shifting identity of the leader shows how an ancient pagan belief was seamlessly absorbed into new religious frameworks, its core terrifying essence remaining intact. The members of the hunt were just as feared as its master. They were the unholy retinue, the souls of sinners, unbaptized children, and those who died violent or sudden deaths. They were joined by monstrous spectral hounds with glowing red eyes, like the infamous Gabriel hounds of English folklore or the CW circumflexen Anon of Wales. To be caught outdoors during the hunt's passage was to invite disaster. Folklore held that any human who saw the procession might be struck blind or deaf, or worse, their soul might be forcibly taken to join the eternal chase. In some tales, a person could be spirited away to the other world, returning years later, if they returned at all, aged and mad. In others, the hunt acted as a harbinger of catastrophe, its appearance foretelling war, plague, or the death of a prominent figure. This myth served a powerful psychological and social purpose in the medieval world. On one level, it was a straightforward explanation for terrifying, unexplained nocturnal sounds. The roar of a gale, the cracking of trees in a forest, or the distant cries of migrating birds. On a deeper level, it enforced a strict moral and social code. The story was a potent warning: stay inside after dark, respect the boundaries of the community, and live a virtuous life, lest you attract the attention of the furious dead. It graphically illustrated the permeable and dangerous boundary between the world of the living and the world of the spirit. The sky itself became a thin veil, and on certain liminal nights like Halloween, Yule, or the eve of a saint's day, that veil could be torn aside, revealing the chaos and judgment that lurked just beyond the safety of the hearth. The enduring power of the Wild Hunt lies in its primal imagery. It is the ultimate expression of nature's untamable fury and the universe's indifference to human concerns. It is the storm given a face and a form, the chilling fear of the dark made manifest. Unlike the quest for a holy relic or a philosopher's stone, the hunt offered no reward, no test to pass. It was pure, uncontrollable supernatural power, a reminder that for all their castles and cathedrals, medieval people lived in a world they believed was alive with forces far beyond their comprehension or control. Yet for all the cosmic terror of the Wild Hunt, a force of nature sweeping across the skies, there existed another spectral figure who walked the earth alone, a solitary, immortal soul whose curse was not to ride with a furious host but to wander in endless exile. This is the deeply human and haunting myth of the Wandering Jew. Unlike the grand, apocalyptic visions of the hunt, this legend is intimate and personal, centered on a single man cursed for a moment of profound cruelty. The story first emerges in the 13th century, claiming that as Jesus struggled under the weight of the cross on his way to Golgotha, he paused to rest for a moment at the doorstep of a Jewish man. The man, a cobbler named Ahasuerus in later versions, taunted him and harshly told him to move on. Jesus responded with a fateful sentence: "I will stand and rest, but you will go on until the end of time." In that single divine pronouncement, a mortal man was transformed into a living monument to judgment. He was not struck down. Instead, he was denied the release of death itself. Cursed with immortality, he was condemned to walk the earth, age without dying, and witness all of human history unfold until the second coming. This myth spread like wildfire across medieval Europe, appearing in pamphlets, sermons, and folklore. It wasn't just a story. For many, it was considered a factual account. Reported sightings of this weary traveler popped up in cities from Brussels to Vienna, each account describing a man of immense age, dressed in ragged clothes, filled with an unbearable sorrow, and always moving, never able to settle or find peace. The power of this legend lay in its dual nature as both a cautionary tale and a form of theological evidence. On one hand, it served as a stark warning against the sins of pride, hard-heartedness, and a lack of mercy. The Wandering Jew was the ultimate example of a wasted life, a man who had directly encountered the divine and chosen scorn over compassion. His eternal suffering was a lesson to every Christian about the grave consequences of turning away from Christ and failing to offer basic human kindness. His endless journey was a perpetual reminder that every action, no matter how small, carried spiritual weight. On the other hand, for a medieval Christian populace, the Wandering Jew served as living proof of their faith's central events. His continued existence was tangible evidence that the crucifixion had truly happened. He was a walking, talking relic from the time of Christ, a first-hand witness whose very body confirmed the gospel stories. In an age before mass media or widespread literacy, such a figure lent a powerful sense of concrete reality to the foundational narrative of Christianity. He was not a symbol in a stained glass window. He was supposedly a man you might actually meet on a dusty road, a living connection to the most pivotal moment in sacred history. Tragically, this myth also became a vessel for deep-seated anti-Semitism, which was already rampant in medieval Europe. The figure of the Jew, as the one who rejected Christ, was often used to embody all that was seen as alien and unbelieving within Christian society. The curse of the Wandering Jew was sometimes wrongfully extended as a collective punishment. used to justify prejudice and persecution against Jewish communities. The myth painted a picture of a people forever condemned to be rootless and homeless, a harmful stereotype that had devastating real-world consequences. This dark aspect of the legend shows how spiritual stories could be weaponized to reinforce social divisions and validate existing hatreds. Yet beyond this hateful interpretation, the story holds a more universal and profoundly human resonance. At its core, the wandering Jew is a figure of ultimate loneliness and the agony of remembrance. He is a man trapped in time, forced to watch everyone he ever knows or loves grow old and die century after century. He is the embodiment of regret, forever replaying that one terrible mistake at his doorstep. He is not a monster but a profoundly tragic figure, a warning about the psychological prison of living without forgiveness or redemption. His endless walk is not just a physical journey, but a metaphor for the soul that cannot find rest, forever seeking a home it can never reach, a peace it can never attain. If the wandering Jew represents a soul trapped in endless, solitary exile, then the myth of the dragon slayer saints presents its glorious opposite, a soul so fortified by faith that it can confront and conquer the most monstrous evil. Across medieval Europe, in countless church frescoes and stained glass windows, one image became universally powerful: a radiant knight on horseback, his lance driven deep into the throat of a monstrous serpent. This, of course, is Saint George, the most famous of the dragon slayers, but his story is part of a much richer tradition that includes figures like Saint Margaret of Antioch, who battled a dragon from within its own belly. These were not mere adventure tales, they were profound spiritual allegories, a core part of the medieval church's teaching that visualized the internal struggle against sin as an external, epic battle. The legend of Saint George is the archetype. It typically tells of a pagan city terrorized by a dragon that demanded regular human sacrifices chosen by lot. The fateful day arrives when the king's own daughter, a pure and beloved princess, is selected as the next victim. As she awaits her doom by a lake, the dragon emerges, a creature of pure appetite and destruction. But then, the Christian knight George arrives. He does not flee. He makes the sign of the cross, charges forward, and after a fierce struggle, manages to wound the beast and subdue it. He then uses the princess's girdle as a leash to lead the now docile dragon back to the city. Astonished and terrified, the townspeople watch as George offers to slay the creature completely if they all agree to be baptized. They consent, and with the dragon destroyed, a new era of Christian faith begins for the entire kingdom. Every element of this story is meticulously crafted symbolism. The dragon is never just a large lizard. It is the embodiment of the devil, paganism, and the sin that devours the human soul. The lake it inhabits often represents the dark, chaotic waters of the pre-creation abyss, a place of primordial evil. The princess is not just a damsel in distress. She is often interpreted as the church itself, or the human soul held captive by fear and sin. George's victory is achieved not solely by martial prowess, but by his invocation of the cross, the ultimate symbol of Christ's triumph over death. His act of leading the dragon back to the city transforms the monster from a hidden terror into a publicly vanquished foe, demonstrating that faith can bring even our deepest sins into the light to be defeated. The mass conversion that follows shows that the victory of one saint's faith has the power to redeem an entire community. Saint Margaret's story offers a different, even more visceral perspective on this spiritual combat. According to her legend, the Roman prefect Olybrius, enchanted by her beauty, demanded she renounce her Christian faith and marry him. When she refused, she was subjected to brutal tortures. While imprisoned, the devil appeared to her in the form of a dragon. It swallowed her whole, but inside the beast's belly, Margaret made the sign of the cross. The gesture was so powerful it caused the dragon's body to rupture open, freeing her unharmed. Her victory from within the beast's very core made her an incredibly powerful symbol for the medieval faithful. She became the patron saint of childbirth because her story mirrored the perilous journey of an infant through the birth canal and into the world, a process where both mother and child faced mortal danger. Her prayer was believed to offer protection, a spiritual shield in a moment of extreme vulnerability. These dragon-slaying myths were incredibly effective teaching tools for a largely illiterate population. A peasant who might struggle to understand a theological lecture on resisting temptation could immediately grasp the meaning of an icon showing a saint spearing a monstrous serpent. The dragon was a versatile and powerful symbol for a host of internal and external threats. It could represent personal sins like greed or wrath, the external threat of pagan invaders, or the ever-present fear of hell. The saints provided a model of unwavering courage. They showed that evil, no matter how terrifying, could be overcome through faith, and that such a victory often led to the salvation of others. They were the ultimate spiritual champions, and their stories offered immense comfort and hope, assuring people that they were not alone in their daily struggles against darkness. Yet even the triumphant victory of a saint over a dragon could not shield humanity from its oldest and most universal fear, the inevitable reality of death itself. In an era where life was often brutally short and death a constant, visible presence, a powerful and haunting myth emerged to confront this fear directly, not with a promise of earthly immortality, but with a stark, unforgettable reminder of it. This is the allegory of the three living and the three dead, a memento mori tale that spread across Europe in the form of chilling wall paintings, illuminated manuscripts, and fiery sermons. The story is simple in its structure but devastating in its impact. It tells of three young kings, embodiments of earthly power, wealth, and vitality, who are out hawking in the countryside. They are at the very peak of their lives, surrounded by the pleasures and privileges of their station. Suddenly, their joyous hunt is interrupted. They come upon three horrific figures, their own decaying doppelgangers. These are not mere skeletons, but corpses in advanced stages of decomposition, figures of putrefaction and rot who speak with a terrible prophetic authority. The encounter is a masterwork of medieval psychological terror. The three living kings react with horror, and the three dead respond with a grim message that varies slightly in different versions but always carries the same essential warning. One corpse might say, "What you are, we once were. What we are, you will become." Another might admonish them, "Your beauty will be devoured by worms, your wealth is meaningless, and your power is an illusion that death will swiftly erase." The corpses force the living kings, and by extension, every person who saw these images painted on church walls, to stare into the face of their own future. This was not a threat of punishment, but a simple, inescapable statement of fact. The myth stripped away all the vanities of the world to reveal the one truth that every person, from emperor to beggar, had to eventually accept. This stark visualization served a crucial spiritual purpose in medieval society. In a world ordered by the rigid hierarchy of feudalism, where kings and nobles held life and death power over their subjects, the myth of the three living and the three dead was a powerful social and theological equalizer. It proclaimed that the grave was the ultimate democracy. No amount of gold, no army of knights, no fortified castle could protect you from the fate that awaited everyone. A king's corpse would decay just as quickly as a peasant's. This idea was meant to instill a sense of humility in the powerful and a sense of perspective in the oppressed. It challenged the living to consider not how they could extend their earthly reign, but how they should prepare for their eternal one. The artistic depictions of this myth were deliberately graphic and unsettling, designed to provoke a visceral response that would lead to spiritual reflection. In paintings, the three living are always shown in rich, colorful garments, their faces full of life and horror. The three dead are often greenish or blackened, with flesh peeling from their bones, worms crawling from their eye sockets, and toads, symbols of impurity, nesting on their bodies. They are shown emerging from their coffins, sometimes still wearing the tattered remnants of fine clothing, a detail that drove the message home with brutal clarity. This was the fate of the tailored tunic and the silk embroidery. This image was a direct call to action, urging viewers to turn away from worldly concerns and focus on the state of their soul through prayer, confession, and charitable works. The ultimate lesson was not to despair in the face of death, but to use the awareness of it as a motivator to live a good and pious life, ensuring a favorable judgment in the world to come. It was a myth that used horror not to paralyze, but to liberate the soul from its attachment to transient things. But if the memento mori tales forced a confrontation with the grim reality of the grave, the medieval imagination also offered an escape route into a world of breathtaking beauty and perilous enchantment, the realm of the Fairy Queen. This was no simple children's story. It was a deeply ingrained belief in a parallel society of powerful, immortal beings who existed just beyond the edge of human perception. Figures like Morgan Le Fay from the Arthurian cycles or the later literary Teutonia ruled over these hidden kingdoms, realms of eternal twilight where the rules of human time and morality did not apply. Their courts were said to be places of impossible splendor, filled with music that could drive a mortal mad with joy, and forests where the trees themselves were alive with ancient magic. Yet this beauty was a lure, a glamour cast over a world that was fundamentally alien and often hostile to humankind. The power of these monarchs was absolute within their domains. Morgan Le Fay, whose very name means Morgan the Fairy, is a fascinatingly complex figure. In some tales, she is a healer, a wise woman schooled in the magical arts on the mystical Isle of Avalon. In others, she is a formidable antagonist to King Arthur, a mistress of illusion and manipulation. This duality captures the medieval ambivalence toward fairy folk. They could be sources of wisdom and healing, but they were just as likely to be agents of chaos and discord. A fairy queen like Morgan did not operate within a Christian framework of good and evil. She followed her own inscrutable codes and agendas, making her both intriguing and terrifying to the medieval mind. She represented a form of power that was entirely separate from the hierarchies of church and state, a wild card that could upend the established order with a whisper. This idea of a separate spiritual hierarchy was profoundly important. Medieval society was rigidly structured from the peasantry up to the king and the pope. The fairy realm offered a complete alternative to this. It had its own queens and kings, its own knights and servants, its own laws and customs. This mirrored a deep-seated human suspicion that the world was far more complex than it appeared, and that humanity was not necessarily at the top of the spiritual food chain. Encountering the fairy queen's retinue on a misty path was to be suddenly made aware that you were an insignificant subject in a much larger, hidden empire. It was a humbling and frightening experience that reinforced the idea that the visible world was only a small part of a much greater, unseen reality. The dangerous allure of these beings was most potently expressed in the concept of the summons. Stories abounded of individuals, particularly those with artistic talents or a melancholic disposition, being invited or even abducted into the fairy queen's world. A poet might be taken to provide entertainment for the court, or a young man or woman might be chosen as a consort. Time, it was said, flowed differently there. A night of dancing in the fairy mound might translate to 100 years passing in the human world. The mortal who returned would find everyone they had ever known long dead, themselves utterly alone and out of place. This was not just a whimsical adventure, it was a cautionary tale about the perils of becoming too enchanted with the supernatural, of losing one's foothold in the tangible world of human community and faith. The fairy queen represented the ultimate forbidden desire, the promise of eternal youth and artistic inspiration, but at the potential cost of one's soul, one's sanity, and one's very place in the world. And so we arrive at a myth that is less a story and more a breathtaking architectural blueprint of the cosmos itself, the angelic hierarchy. In a world so deeply structured by the feudal system, from the lowliest serf to the king himself, it was only natural that medieval theologians would envision the spiritual realm as the ultimate, perfected version of their own society. This was not a chaotic pantheon of independent gods, but a meticulously ordered celestial court, a vast and glorious bureaucracy of divine will, with every being having its specific rank, purpose, and place. This grand vision was most famously codified by two towering intellectual figures, a mysterious 5th or 6th century Syrian monk known as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, and the great 13th century philosopher Saint Thomas Aquinas. Pseudo-Dionysius, in his work The Celestial Hierarchy, proposed a system of 9 choirs or orders of angels organized into 3 spheres of 3 choirs each. This structure was not just a list, it was a detailed map of how divine love and illumination flowed down from God through these perfected intermediaries and finally to humanity. The first sphere, dwelling in the immediate, blinding presence of God, consists of the angels who exist purely for contemplation and adoration. The highest of all are the seraphim, whose name means the burning ones. They are often depicted as beings of pure fire and light, with 6 wings, 2 to cover their faces in reverence before God's glory, 2 to cover their feet in humility, and 2 with which to fly. Their eternal song, Holy, 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 is the very engine of cosmic praise. Next are the cherubim, not the chubby babies of later art, but awe-inspiring, multi-eyed guardians of divine wisdom and the majesty of God. They are the keen-eyed observers, the holders of celestial knowledge. Completing this innermost circle are the thrones, sometimes described as great wheels covered in eyes, emanating the fiery light of justice. They are the living chariots of God, the embodiments of divine authority and judgment from which God himself pronounces his decrees. The second sphere acts as the celestial government, the administrators of the cosmos. Here we find the dominions or lordships who receive the divine plans from the higher choirs and regulate the duties of the angels below them. They are the divine governors, ensuring the harmony of the universe. Then come the virtues or strongholds, beings of immense power and grace who are charged with carrying out the miracles of God, often seen as the bestowers of grace and valor upon humankind, especially to heroes and saints. The third choir of this sphere are the powers, the warrior angels who stand as the border guard between the heavenly and the demonic realms. They are the defenders of the cosmos and of human souls, combating negative influences and maintaining cosmic order, the spiritual equivalent of a kingdom's most trusted knights and border lords. Finally, the third sphere is the one that interacts most directly with humanity, the messengers and personal guardians. The principalities or princedoms are the guardian angels of nations, cities, and large institutions, guiding the collective destinies of groups of people toward divine order. Then come the archangels, the great heralds and champions who appear at the most critical moments in salvation history. Michael the protector and military leader, Gabriel the divine messenger of the Annunciation, and Raphael the healer and guide. The lowest and in many ways most intimate choir are simply the angels, our personal guardians. This is the rank closest to us, the ones who deliver God's comfort, answer our prayers, and walk beside us in our daily lives, forming the final link in the great chain of being that connects the humblest human soul directly to the throne of the Almighty. This entire elaborate structure was far more than theological speculation. It was a profound comfort and a testament to the medieval mind's love of order. In an earthly life that could be brutal, short, and seemingly random, the angelic hierarchy presented a universe that was fundamentally rational, purposeful, and beautifully organized. Every star in its orbit, every angel in its choir, and every person in their social station had a role to play in the grand design. It reflected the ideal of the great chain of being, a concept that saw all creation, from minerals and plants to animals, humans, angels, and God, as a continuous, interlinked hierarchy of existence. This myth assured people that they were not alone in a cold void, but were citizens of a vast, well-run spiritual empire, watched over by guardians, guided by princes, and ultimately loved by a god who had structured all of reality to function with perfect divine logic. Yet if the angelic hierarchy represented the divine blueprint for cosmic order, a meticulously structured kingdom of light, then medieval theologians believed there must exist a dark mirror image, a twisted, infernal parody of that sacred order. This terrifying notion gave rise to one of the most elaborate and fearsome spiritual projects of the Middle Ages, the demonic classification. This was not mere superstition. It was a complex system of spiritual taxonomy, an attempt to bring logical order to the ultimate chaos of evil itself. In a world where every misfortune, from a failed harvest to a sudden illness, could be interpreted as a spiritual attack, people craved a framework to understand their invisible adversaries. If you could name a demon, understand its rank, and know its specialty, you could, in theory, defend against it. This was spiritual warfare mapped onto a feudal organizational chart, turning the amorphous terror of the devil into a manageable, if still horrifying, bureaucracy of hell. This grim cataloging project found its most detailed expression in grimoires, books of magical knowledge, and theological texts, with one of the most influential being the 15th century manuscript known as the Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, or the False Monarchy of Demons, compiled by the German physician and occultist Johann Weyer. Later, the 17th century work, The Lesser Key of Solomon, would expand these ideas into an even more detailed infernal directory. These texts did not just list demons, they constructed an entire dark court, complete with kings, dukes, earls, and knights, each commanding legions of lesser spirits and each possessing a specific domain of influence over human affairs. At the very top of this inverted hierarchy sat powerful figures like Lucifer, the Emperor of Hell, but the true focus was often on the specialized lieutenants who carried out his will in the mortal world. The specificity of these demonic portfolios is fascinating, as it directly reflects the deepest anxieties of medieval life. For instance, the demon Beleth was said to be a mighty king who rode a pale horse, accompanied by the sound of trumpets, and could incite love between men and women, a dangerous manipulation of human emotion. Forbot, a Grand Duke, specialized in extinguishing lights and making things invisible, playing on the primal fear of darkness and the unseen. The demon Prufflers was a prince and a great duke who was blamed for stirring up quarrels, lawsuits, and falsehoods, a direct reflection of the social and legal tensions within communities. Perhaps most tellingly, a demon like Nabrius was tasked with stealing the grace and honor of men, while others were assigned to sow discord in households or cause wounds to fester. Each entry in this infernal catalogue reads like a list of the period's most common social, physical, and psychological calamities, each given a name and a face. This practice of classification was deeply tied to the medieval belief in the power of names. Knowing a demon's true name was thought to grant a measure of power over it, a concept with ancient roots. Exorcism rituals relied on this principle. A priest couldn't simply command a generic spirit of evil to depart. He had to identify it, to confront the specific entity by its name and rank, and then, invoking the higher authority of God and the angels, revoke its license to torment the afflicted person. This turned spiritual combat into a form of celestial litigation, where correct procedure and precise knowledge were the keys to victory. The grimoires essentially served as field manuals for this conflict, providing the necessary intelligence on the enemy's chain of command and tactics. Beyond practical defense, these demonic hierarchies also served a profound psychological and theological purpose. By organizing hell as a dark mirror of heaven's feudal structure, theologians were making a statement about the nature of evil, that it was not an independent, creative force but a parasitic one. Demons, in this view, were fallen angels. They could only corrupt and pervert the good creation of God. They could not create anything new. Their infernal monarchy was a sad imitation of the celestial one, their specialized talents a wicked distortion of the angels' divine roles. This understanding was ultimately comforting. It meant that evil, for all its terrifying power, was still subject to a form of order, and that it existed within the broader and ultimately supreme governance of God. The devil, in the end, was not a rival god but a rebellious subject, and his entire organized kingdom was just a temporary rebellion within a cosmos that would, in the final act, be restored to its perfect holy order. But if the meticulously ordered ranks of angels and demons represented a structured approach to the supernatural, another myth spoke to a far more chaotic and insatiable human desire, the hunger for a singular, ultimate source of power that could bypass all hierarchies and grant mastery with the mere turn of a page. This is the enduring and perilous legend of the Book of Thoth. While its origins lie in the sands of ancient Egypt, this myth found a second life in the medieval imagination, captivating alchemists, Kabbalists, and occultists who were utterly convinced that this ancient text of unimaginable power was not entirely lost, but merely waiting to be rediscovered by a seeker brave or foolish enough to claim it. In its original Egyptian context, Thoth was the god of wisdom, writing, and magic, the divine scribe who recorded the verdict of the soul's weighing of the heart. The Book of Thoth was said to contain two primary spells of cosmic significance. The first would grant the reader the ability to understand the speech of animals, to perceive the sun and the moon directly in the sky, and to see the very gods themselves. The second spell was far more practical and dangerous. It would allow the magician to enchant the inanimate world, to command spirits, and to achieve a power that rivaled the gods themselves. The ancient tales warned of severe consequences for those who sought this knowledge without being worthy, a theme that would echo powerfully for medieval seekers. For the medieval mind, steeped in a profound reverence for Prisca Theologia, the idea that a single, pure, divine truth had been given to humanity in antiquity, and then fragmented and lost over time, the Book of Thoth became the ultimate symbol of this lost wisdom. It wasn't just an Egyptian text, it was imagined as the primordial sourcebook from which all later magical and philosophical knowledge flowed. Medieval scholars believed that the great wise men of the Bible, like Moses or Solomon, might have had access to its secrets, accounting for their miraculous powers. They pictured it not as a simple papyrus scroll, but as a vast tome of indestructible materials, its pages perhaps made of mysterious black stone or hammered copper, inscribed with a language of power that predated the confusion of Babel. This belief fueled a frantic and often dangerous pursuit across Europe and the Middle East. Anecdotes and rumors swirled of scholars who had glimpsed fragments of the book in the hidden libraries of Alexandria before its destruction, or of Moorish sages in Spain who guarded copies translated into Arabic. The quest was not for the faint of heart. The myth was always intertwined with a curse. It was said that the knowledge within the book was so potent that it would inevitably destroy any mortal who possessed it. The original Egyptian story ended with the book's discoverer suffering a terrible fate for his transgression, and this warning was amplified in medieval retellings. To seek the Book of Thoth was to dance with the demonic, to risk one's soul for a power that was never meant for human hands. This pursuit perfectly illustrates the double-edged nature of the medieval quest for knowledge. On one hand, it was a noble, almost sacred endeavor to recover the wisdom of the ancients and thereby come closer to understanding God's creation. The search for the book drove scholars to learn ancient languages, study astronomy and mathematics, and preserve texts that might otherwise have been lost. On the other hand, it constantly flirted with heresy and hubris. The Church viewed such pursuits with deep suspicion, seeing them as a desire to usurp divine power rather than to submit to it. The seeker of the Book of Thoth was not a humble pilgrim but an ambitious sorcerer, attempting to seize control of the levers of the universe through a technical manual rather than through prayer and grace. This myth, therefore, stands as a powerful allegory for the eternal human tension between reverence for sacred mystery and the burning, reckless drive to uncover every secret, no matter the cost. Yet this hunger for ultimate knowledge, this drive to unlock every secret of the universe through a single, powerful artifact, was not confined to the search for a lost book. It found an even more audacious and terrifying expression in the medieval obsession with creating an oracle, an artificial mind that could simply be asked for the answers. This is the captivating and eerie legend of the Brazen Head, a myth that stands as a stunningly prescient precursor to our modern conversations about artificial intelligence. The stories typically feature the greatest scholarly minds of the age, figures like the Dominican bishop and alchemist Albertus Magnus, or the Franciscan friar and pioneering scientist Roger Bacon. These men, already legendary for their vast learning, were said to have used their knowledge of astrology, mathematics, and the occult arts to undertake the ultimate experiment, forging a head out of brass or bronze, and then, through complex rites and celestial alignments, imbuing it with the power of speech and thought. The purpose of these heads was breathtakingly ambitious. They were not built for companionship or manual labor. They were designed to be oracles. Their creators, it was said, needed answers to the most profound questions plaguing humanity. A head like this could supposedly predict the future, reveal the outcomes of wars, unveil the secrets of the stars, or explain the deepest mysteries of theology and philosophy. It was the dream of a perfect database, an infallible search engine made of metal and magic, capable of cutting through uncertainty and delivering absolute truth. The very notion reveals a profound medieval tension, a deep faith in divine providence coexisting with an equally powerful desire to wrest control of fate through the application of arcane knowledge. The methods attributed to its construction were a fascinating blend of rigorous science and mystical belief. Roger Bacon's head, for instance, was said to have been forged under a specific and powerful astrological alignment, its internal mechanisms crafted with such precision that they could mimic the functions of a human brain. Some legends described it as a complex automaton, an early robot powered by gears, levers, and the hidden forces of magnetism. Others claimed its power came from a captured demon or elemental spirit bound within the metal shell, forced to serve its master. Albertus Magnus was rumored to have spent 30 years constructing his head, a testament to the immense difficulty of the task. This fusion of mechanical engineering, astrological timing, and outright necromancy shows how the medieval world did not see a clear line between what we would now call science and magic. To them, it was all part of a unified field of hidden knowledge waiting to be mastered. But these stories almost always carry the same chilling, inevitable twist. The head's creation is a success, but its use ends in catastrophic failure. The most common version of the tale tells of the scholar finally completing his decades-long labor. He must then leave the head to incubate or to gather power for a set period, perhaps days or weeks. He instructs his simple-minded servant to watch over the head and to wake him immediately the moment it speaks. Exhausted, the master falls asleep. The servant keeps his vigil until at last the brazen head opens its mouth. But its first words are not a grand revelation. They are a simple, ominous statement of fact. Time is. The servant, thinking this too trivial to wake his master for, does nothing. Later, the head speaks again. Time was. Again, the servant dismisses it. Finally, the head cries out a third and final time. Time is past, and then promptly shatters into 1,000 pieces, its power spent, its opportunity lost forever. This heartbreakingly poetic ending is the true core of the myth. It is a powerful moral fable about the dangers of hubris. The scholar, in his quest to become like God, to create a thinking being and possess all knowledge, has overreached. The head's cryptic pronouncements are not a failure of its programming. They are the ultimate wisdom, a lesson its creator was too prideful to hear. Time is speaks to the present moment, the only time in which one can truly act and learn. Is a lament for the missed opportunity. Time is past is the final judgment, the irreversible closing of the door. The message is that some forms of knowledge cannot be captured and stored like a commodity. True wisdom is earned through lived experience and spiritual growth, not downloaded from a machine. The quest for a shortcut to omniscience is ultimately a race against time that no human can win. The myth of the brazen head resonates so powerfully today because it is, in essence, a medieval warning about artificial intelligence. It grapples with the same ethical and philosophical questions we face now. Can a created intelligence ever truly understand the human condition? If we outsource our thinking to a machine, what parts of our own humanity might we lose? And is there a point where the pursuit of knowledge becomes a dangerous obsession that blinds us to the more immediate, important truth right in front of us? The shattered head is a symbol of the limits of human ambition, a reminder that the most valuable answers are not found in a prophecy, but in the humble, mindful engagement with the time we are given. But for all the intricate gears and prophetic whispers of the brazen head, some of the most potent magic in the medieval world was believed to spring not from a smith's forge, but directly from the earth itself, in the form of a root that mirrored the human form. This brings us to the haunting and deeply personal myth of the mandrake, a plant that occupied a unique space in the medieval imagination, straddling the line between powerful medicine and dangerous semi-sentient spirit. The mandrake, or mandragora, was not just another herb. Its root often grew in a twisted, bifurcated shape that uncannily resembled a tiny human being, complete with head, torso, and legs. This resemblance, explained by the ancient doctrine of signatures, which held that plants revealed their uses through their appearance, convinced people that this root was imbued with a unique and formidable life force. It was a creature of the earth that seemed to yearn for the world of men, and its power was as perilous as it was prized. The most famous and terrifying aspect of the mandrake myth was its fatal scream. It was widely believed that when pulled from the ground, the root would emit a shriek so piercing and powerful that it could kill anyone who heard it. This wasn't a simple superstition. It was considered a genuine physical danger, a natural defense mechanism for a being that was half plant, half spirit. This belief necessitated incredibly elaborate and theatrical harvesting rituals, turning the act of retrieving a root into a high-stakes magical operation. The most common method, described in countless herbals and grimoires, involved carefully loosening the soil around the plant until its root was exposed but not yet freed. The harvester would then tie a rope around the base of the plant and attach the other end to a hungry black dog. The person would then retreat to a safe distance, cover their own ears, and entice the dog to run forward with a piece of meat or by calling to it. The dog, lunging for the food, would yank the mandrake from the earth, absorbing its deadly scream and dying in the process. The harvester could then safely approach and collect the now harmless, yet still immensely powerful root. Once safely procured, the mandrake's uses were as varied as they were potent. It was a true panacea, a multi-purpose talisman for the challenges of medieval life. In matters of the heart, it was unparalleled. A small piece of the root carried on one's person was believed to be an irresistible attractant, a powerful amulet for attracting love and ensuring fidelity. It was often fashioned into simple dolls or figurines, which would be dressed in tiny clothes and treated as a member of the household, believed to bring prosperity and good fortune to the home. But its power extended far beyond romance. Farmers would place pieces of mandrake in their barns and stables to protect their livestock from disease and bewitchment, and in their fields to ensure a bountiful harvest, believing it could ward off blight and encourage growth. Its medicinal applications were equally profound, if frightening. The plant is in reality highly toxic and contains powerful tropane alkaloids, the same compounds found in deadly nightshade. In very small, carefully measured doses, these compounds can act as a sedative, an anesthetic, or a painkiller. medieval physicians and cunning folk would use tiny slivers of the root to treat everything from insomnia and melancholy to the agony of surgery or childbirth. However, the line between medicine and poison was razor thin, and an incorrect dosage could easily lead to delirium, coma, or death. This inherent danger only added to the mandrake's fearsome reputation. It was a healer that demanded the utmost respect, a servant that could quickly become a master if handled carelessly. What makes the mandrake myth so enduring is how it embodies the medieval relationship with the natural world. People of this era did not see plants as simple, passive substances. They believed the earth was alive with spirit and intention, and the mandrake was the ultimate expression of this, a natural object so charged with power it required a ritual of sacrifice to obtain. It represents a world where humanity was in constant negotiation with its environment, seeking blessings and remedies from a nature that was both generous and fiercely wild. The mandrake wasn't just a tool, it was a partner, a protector, and a peril, a perfect symbol of the medieval belief that the greatest gifts often came with the gravest risks, hidden just beneath the surface of the familiar world. But while the mandrake represented a perilous power drawn from the earth, another legendary creature embodied a corruption so absolute that it could poison the very ground it walked upon. This is the terrifying myth of the basilisk, the serpent king whose very glance meant instant death and whose breath could wither entire fields and crumble stone walls to dust. Born from a paradoxical and unnatural egg, laid by a 7-year-old rooster and hatched by a toad on a bed of dung, the basilisk was the antithesis of natural order. Medieval bestiaries described it as a small serpent, sometimes crowned or adorned with a white spot on its head like a diadem, but its lack of size was a horrific deception. Its true power was not in its strength but in its absolute toxicity. It was believed to be so venomous that if a man on horseback killed one with a spear, the poison would travel up the shaft, kill the rider, and then the horse as well. It was a creature that turned its entire environment into a wasteland, a living embodiment of plague and blight. This myth was a powerful fusion of ancient lore and medieval Christian symbolism. The basilisk's roots stretch back to the deserts of North Africa, where Greek and Roman naturalists like Pliny the Elder described a small but deadly serpent called the Regulus or Little King. Its reputation grew in the telling, and by the Middle Ages it had been fully absorbed into the Christian worldview as a perfect symbol of the devil himself. Its lethal gaze mirrored the concept of sin entering the soul through the eyes, a temptation that could spiritually kill a person. Its ability to wither plants and shatter stone represented the corrosive power of evil to destroy both the fruits of the earth and the strongest foundations of faith. The basilisk was sin made manifest, a physical creature that demonstrated how corruption could spread insidiously, poisoning everything it touched. Faced with such an overwhelming threat, medieval logic turned to a system of symbolic counters. The primary weapon against the basilisk was, ironically, another animal noted for its keen sight, the weasel. It was believed that the weasel was immune to the basilisk's gaze and could hunt and kill the creature in its lair, though the weasel itself would often perish from the serpent's fumes shortly after its victory. This was seen as a parable of Christ's harrowing of hell, a righteous sacrifice to defeat a great evil. Another, more practical method involved using a mirror. A person could, in theory, safely confront a basilisk by holding up a polished glass or shield. The creature would be forced to meet its own gaze, and the reflected power of its own evil would turn inward and destroy it. This was a brilliantly elegant solution that taught a clear moral lesson, that evil is ultimately self-destructive, and that confronting it with truth and reflection is the surest path to victory. The myth of the basilisk, for all its horror, was ultimately a story about the resilience of the human spirit and the belief that even the most absolute evil could be outwitted and overcome. And so we come to a creature whose very essence seemed to oppose the toxic corruption of the basilisk, a being of such grace and purity that its presence alone could cleanse the world. This is the enduring and luminous myth of the unicorn, a creature that captivated the medieval mind not with terror but with a vision of transcendent holiness. Far from the pastel-colored fantasy of modern tales, the medieval unicorn was a potent and complex symbol, a fierce beast of the wilderness that could only be tamed by the most absolute innocence. Bescheries described it as a magnificent snow-white horse-like creature, though often with the cloven hooves of a stag and the beard of a goat, but its most defining feature was the long, spiraled horn projecting from its forehead, a horn believed to possess miraculous, life-giving properties. This alicorn, as the horn was known, was considered one of the most powerful antidotes in the medieval world. It was said that a unicorn could purify a poisoned spring simply by dipping its horn into the water, making it safe for other animals to drink. Cups and utensils crafted from unicorn horn, which were almost always fashioned from narwhal tusks or intricately carved ivory, were owned by kings and popes who believed they could neutralize any poison slipped into their food or wine. This wasn't merely a superstition, it was a deeply held belief in the power of purity to actively combat and nullify corruption. In a world where political assassination by poisoning was a constant fear for the powerful, the unicorn's horn represented a tangible, if elusive, form of divine protection, a physical manifestation of goodness that could defeat the hidden evils of the world. But the unicorn's most profound meaning was found in its spiritual symbolism within the Christian Church. The creature's legendary capture became a rich allegory for the incarnation of Christ. The story, as told in Bescheries and illuminated manuscripts, was that the unicorn was far too swift and powerful to be taken by any hunter's net or spear. Its only weakness was its attraction to absolute purity. The only way to capture one was to send a young virgin maiden into the forest and have her sit alone under a tree. Sensing her innocence, the wild and furious unicorn would approach, lay its head gently in her lap and fall into a tranquil sleep, at which point the hunters could emerge and take it. For medieval theologians, this was a perfect parallel to the story of Christ. The unicorn represented the divine logos, the powerful and untamable word of God that could not be captured by human means. The Virgin Maiden was, of course, the Virgin Mary. Through her unique purity and grace, she was able to draw the divine spirit into the world, to capture it in human form within her womb, thus making God accessible to humanity. The hunters who then took the unicorn were interpreted as the forces of the world that would ultimately lead to Christ's sacrifice, a necessary part of the divine plan for salvation. This spiritual interpretation made the unicorn one of the most beloved and frequently depicted creatures in medieval religious art. It appears in countless tapestries, most famously the series known as The Hunt of the Unicorn, where each stage of the pursuit from the elusive animal roaming the forest to its eventual capture and later resurrection is laden with Christian symbolism. The unicorn resting in the maiden's lap became a direct stand-in for Christ resting in Mary's arms. Its white color symbolized Christ's sinless nature, and its single horn was seen as a symbol of the unity of God and Christ, or of the single-minded focus of faith that pierces through deception. The myth offered a beautiful and accessible way to explain complex theological concepts to the faithful, transforming an abstract idea into a tangible and emotionally resonant story of love, sacrifice, and redemption. The enduring power of the unicorn myth lies in this perfect fusion of the wild and the gentle, the powerful and the pure. It represented a bridge between the untamed, dangerous natural world and the ordered, spiritual safety of divine grace. It was a creature that could purify poison and defeat corruption, yet it submitted willingly to innocence. This paradox made it a uniquely hopeful symbol. It suggested that the divine was not distant or indifferent, but was drawn to and actively sought out purity in the human soul. In a world often perceived as fallen and corrupt, The unicorn was a promise that holiness was not only possible but had a tangible, powerful presence that could actively heal a broken world, offering a vision of grace that was as fierce and real as it was gentle and divine. Yet if the unicorn symbolized a purity that could tame the wild and heal the world, the phoenix presented an even more dramatic vision of hope, not through gentle submission, but through total, fiery annihilation and glorious rebirth. This magnificent bird, said to live for 500 years or more, knew when its end was near. It would build a nest of the most fragrant spices, cinnamon, frankincense, and myrrh, and then, as the sun reached its zenith, it would turn itself toward the rays, beat its wings, and ignite the pyre, consuming itself in a brilliant, purifying blaze. But from those very same ashes, a new, young phoenix would emerge, often even more radiant than before, ready to begin the cycle anew. This wasn't just a story about a bird. It was a powerful, universal allegory for death and renewal that resonated across cultures, from ancient Egypt and Greece to the heart of medieval Christian Europe. For the medieval church, the phoenix became one of the most potent and beloved symbols for the resurrection of Christ and the promise of eternal life for all believers. Early Christian writers like Clement of Rome saw in its story a perfect natural parallel to their core doctrine. Just as the bird seemed to die only to be reborn, so too did Christ willingly undergo death on the cross to rise again on the third day, conquering death forever. The spices in the phoenix's nest were interpreted as the spices used to anoint Christ's body for burial, and the 3 days it was said to take for the new bird to emerge mirrored the 3 days Christ spent in the tomb. This symbolism was eagerly adopted in bestiaries, sermons, and art, providing a tangible, natural world proof for the seemingly impossible concept of bodily resurrection. It offered a comforting answer to a fundamental human anxiety, that the decay of the body was not the end, but merely a necessary step toward a glorious, perfected new existence. Within the secretive world of the alchemists, the phoenix took on an equally profound but more personal meaning. They saw the bird cycle as the ultimate metaphor for the magnum opus, the great work of spiritual and metallic transformation. The process of turning base lead into philosophical gold was not a simple chemical reaction. It was a spiritual death and rebirth. The initial stage, the nigrido or blackening, where the prime matter would putrefy and decompose in the flask, was the alchemist's fire. It represented the necessary destruction of the ego, the burning away of all earthly attachments and impurities within the seeker's own soul. This was a period of profound spiritual despair and darkness, essential for any true growth. From this blackness would eventually arise the albedo, the whitening, a state of purification and clarity symbolized by the white dove or the unicorn. But the final and highest stage was the rubedo, the reddening, which was universally represented by the phoenix. This was the culmination of the work, the creation of the philosopher's stone, and the simultaneous spiritual rebirth of the alchemist. The fiery death of the old, flawed self gave way to the birth of a new, enlightened being, an immortal spirit perfected and freed from the cycle of base desires. The phoenix's ascent from its own ashes was, for the alchemist, the ultimate symbol of achieving a state of gnosis, or direct knowledge of the divine, having been utterly consumed and remade by the sacred fire of transformation. This dual adoption of the myth by both the Orthodox Church and the esoteric alchemical tradition reveals a shared medieval longing to find meaning in suffering and death. Whether through the grace of God or the diligent work of the self, the phoenix promised that destruction was not an end but a crucible. The flames that consumed were not merely punitive, they were purgative and creative. The myth taught that the most beautiful and lasting forms of life often require a complete surrender of the old form. It was a story of incredible hope, asserting that even in the midst of personal tragedy, societal collapse, or the fear of mortality, there exists a timeless pattern of renewal, a sacred promise that from the ashes of what we once were, something new and glorious can always take flight. Leaving behind the majestic cycle of the phoenix, we encounter a creature whose mythical power was not born from flame, but from a defiance of it. This is the strange and paradoxical legend of the salamander, an amphibian believed to be so cold-blooded in the most literal sense that it could not only walk through fire unharmed but could actually extinguish flames on contact. While the real, modest salamander prefers the damp cover of rotting logs, the medieval bestiary version was an elemental force of nature, a spirit of fire that paradoxically thrived within its own destructive element. This belief was so deeply ingrained that well into the Renaissance, figures like Benvenuto Cellini claimed their fathers had actually witnessed the creature tumbling out of a blazing fire, a story repeated as fact. This incredible property was thought to extend beyond the animal itself. Medieval lore held that the salamander produced a peculiar substance, a white wool or silken cocoon it secreted to protect itself. It was believed that cloth woven from this miraculous material known as salamander wool was not just flame-resistant but utterly fireproof. A garment made from it could be thrown into a blazing inferno and be pulled out not only unscathed but actually purified and whitened by the experience, as if laundered by the flames themselves. This made the salamander a symbol of incredible purity and resilience, a being that could engage with the most destructive force in the human world and emerge not just unharmed but perfected. For the alchemists, the salamander became a powerful spiritual emblem. The fiery furnace was the very heart of their work, the sacred space where base metals were broken down in the hope of their eventual transformation. The salamander, sitting serenely in the heart of this fire, represented the prime matter itself, the fundamental substance that could withstand the alchemical process without being consumed. It symbolized the endurance of the spirit through the trials of purification, the part of the self that remains intact and even strengthened through the metaphorical fires of suffering and introspection. In this sense, the seeker aimed to become like the salamander, able to pass through the destructive flames of their own ego and desires and emerge purified on the other side. This symbolism was powerfully adopted by the Christian Church as well. The salamander's ability to thrive in fire made it a perfect symbol for the righteous believer who could remain faithful and pure even when surrounded by the temptations and persecutions of a sinful world. It represented the soul that could walk through the fiery trials of life, as mentioned in the Bible, and not have its faith burned away. Some interpretations even linked it to the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were thrown into the fiery furnace by King Nebuchadnezzar and emerged completely unharmed, accompanied by a divine fourth figure who looked like a son of the gods. The salamander was a natural world echo of this miracle, a constant reminder that faith could provide a supernatural insulation against the world's most destructive forces. The enduring fascination with the salamander myth reveals a medieval mindset that saw the natural world as a complex book of symbols where every creature held a hidden spiritual lesson. The salamander taught that the ultimate power was not to avoid the fire, but to develop the spiritual constitution to exist within it without being consumed. It was a lesson in resilience, a promise that purity and faith could act as a kind of supernatural asbestos for the soul, allowing a person to engage with the dangerous, transformative fires of life and emerge not merely unscathed but refined and renewed. From the elemental resilience of the salamander, we soar now to the very pinnacle of both earth and sky, to a creature whose very form is a declaration of dominion, the majestic and formidable griffin. Picture a beast of such imposing power that it claims two kingdoms as its birthright, the body of a lion, the undisputed king of the terrestrial beasts, fused with the head and powerful wings of an eagle, the sovereign of the skies. This was no mere monster of fantasy. In the medieval mind, the griffin was a very real creature, believed to inhabit the remote, mountainous regions of the north, fiercely guarding its territory and most famously its vast hoards of gold. Ancient writers like Herodotus described them as the sworn enemies of the one-eyed Arimaspians, who ceaselessly attempted to steal their treasure, painting a picture of an eternal, epic struggle between guardian and thief. This role as the ultimate protector made the griffin an immensely powerful symbol for medieval Christendom. Its dual nature offered a perfect allegorical representation of Jesus Christ himself. The lion's body signified his earthly incarnation, his humanity, his kingship over the world, and his resurrection, as the lion was famously thought to breathe life into its stillborn cubs. The eagle's head and wings, however, represented his divine nature, his sovereignty over the heavens, his keen sight that sees all truths, and his ascension into the sky. The griffin, by soaring into the air while remaining tethered to the earth, became a living emblem of the hypostatic union, the theological concept that Christ was both fully human and fully divine, a single person with two natures inseparably joined. This made it a favorite motif in cathedral sculpture and illuminated manuscripts, a visual sermon that communicated complex doctrine through a single, awe-inspiring image. Beyond this core symbolism, the griffin embodied the ideal of spiritual guardianship. Just as it was said to vigilantly guard its physical gold from plunderers, it came to represent the Church's role in guarding the spiritual treasure of faith from the clutches of heresy and demonic influence. Its terrifying strength and ferocity in battle were seen not as wanton aggression, but as righteous fury deployed in the defense of what is sacred. A griffin depicted on a knight's shield or crest was not just a decoration. It was a declaration of that knight's sacred vow to protect the innocent, defend the faith, and combat evil with every ounce of his strength. It was the ultimate symbol of the Christian soul armored in virtue, capable of confronting any earthly temptation or spiritual adversary. The myth of the griffin also speaks to a medieval yearning for reconciliation, for the harmony of opposing forces. It bridged the gap between the animal and the avian, the earthbound and the celestial, strength and wisdom. In a universe often perceived as a battle between dualities good and evil, flesh and spirit, the griffin presented a vision of their perfect and powerful synthesis. It was a creature that had mastered both realms, suggesting that true power and holiness lay not in choosing one nature over the other, but in perfectly integrating them. To encounter a griffin in a bestiary or a church carving was to be reminded of a divine order where contradictions are resolved, where the human and the heavenly can merge into a single, glorious being, forever standing watch over the treasures of creation. Yet for all the griffin's majestic synthesis of earth and sky, its role as a guardian of tangible treasure, the Arthurian legends present us with a creature that is the very embodiment of an intangible and maddening pursuit, the questing beast. This is perhaps the most surreal and allegorically rich monster in the entire medieval canon, a living paradox that defies all natural order. Its anatomy is a nightmare of fused contradictions, the head and neck of a venomous snake, the body of a lithe and powerful leopard, the powerful haunches of a lion, and the cloven feet of a swift hart or deer. But its most defining feature is not its appearance but its sound. From its belly there emanated a constant cacophonous racket, the baying and clamoring of 30 hounds locked in eternal pursuit, a sound that gave the creature its name and its unforgettable aura of frantic, unresolved energy. This beast was not merely a physical challenge for knights to conquer, it was the ultimate symbol of spiritual restlessness. To encounter it was to be confronted with a riddle made flesh, a manifestation of the soul's own desperate, often futile, search for meaning. Its very composition reflects this internal fragmentation. The snake's head represents cunning and often forbidden knowledge, the leopard's body suggests swift but perhaps spotted sin, the lion's haunches speak of raw power without direction, and the hart's feet symbolize a fleetness of purpose that goes nowhere. This creature is a being at war with itself, a collection of powerful parts that can never find harmony or peace, forever generating the noise of the chase but never the satisfaction of the catch. Its primary pursuer in the tales is King Pellinor, a knight whose entire identity becomes consumed by this endless hunt. He is a tragicomic figure, often portrayed as somewhat bumbling and single-minded, forever crashing through thickets, following the baying that only he can seem to hear clearly. His quest is a perfect allegory for a spiritual search that has lost its way, becoming an obsessive compulsion rather than a path to enlightenment. He is so focused on the pursuit itself that he forgets to ask what the beast truly represents or what its capture would even mean. He is driven by the noise, the thrill of the chase, mirroring how we can sometimes become so engrossed in the rituals and motions of seeking, the constant reading, the debates, the searching, that we neglect the quiet, internal work required for actual understanding. The ceaseless sound of the hound's questing is the heart of the myth's meaning. It represents the internal din of a soul that is not at rest, the background noise of existential anxiety, unanswered questions, and divine longing that can both motivate and torment a seeker. It is the sound of the mind that cannot be stilled, always analyzing, doubting, and pursuing a truth that seems to always be just beyond the next hill. This makes the questing beast a profoundly relatable figure, even in our modern age. Who hasn't felt that internal baying, the restless urge to find something more, to understand life's deeper purpose, to chase a fulfillment that remains perpetually out of reach? In the broader tapestry of Arthurian legend, the beast serves as a crucial counterpoint to the quest for the Holy Grail. While the Grail quest is undertaken by the purest knights and leads to a transformative, if fleeting, vision of divine grace, the quest for the beast is a more common, more human struggle. It is the pursuit undertaken before one even knows what one is truly seeking. It is spiritual energy without a clear channel, faith without a specific object. The myth suggests that this stage of restless searching is a necessary, if arduous, part of the journey. One must first be driven by the noise within before one can learn to quiet it enough to hear the still, small voice of actual wisdom. The questing beast, in all its bizarre glory, is not a monster to be slain, but a mirror to be pondered, a reminder that the most important quests begin not with a clear map, but with the unsettling and beautiful noise of a soul that is desperate to find its way home. But even the most surreal internal quest must eventually turn outward, to the very edges of the known world, where medieval maps warned of lands populated by beings who seemed to defy the very definition of humanity itself. Among these, none were more persistent or more troubling to the medieval mind than the Cynosophy, the legendary race of dog-headed humans. Imagine the tales brought back by travelers and embellished by monks hunched over their illuminated manuscripts, stories of a people with the bodies of men but the snarling heads, sharp teeth, and fur-covered faces of powerful hounds. They were said to inhabit the distant, unmapped regions of the world, the mountains of India, the deepest parts of Africa, the misty islands of the far north, places where the normal order of God's creation seemed to break down into strange and fearsome new forms. These accounts were not pure fantasy. They often stemmed from misunderstood encounters. Travelers' reports of baboons or other primates, glimpsed at a distance, could easily transform into legends of beast men. Hearsay about distant cultures with unfamiliar customs, perhaps involving elaborate animal helmets or ritual masks, further fueled the belief. The ancient Greeks wrote of them, Pliny the Elder included them in his natural history, and Saint Augustine himself grappled with their existence in his theological work, The City of God. The central, unnerving question was this: if these creatures had the form of beasts but lived in societies, used tools, and farmed the land, did they possess rational souls? Could a being with the head of a dog be considered human in the eyes of God? And if so, could it be saved? This question struck at the very heart of medieval cosmology and the concept of the great chain of being. This was the idea that all of creation was organized in a strict hierarchical ladder, from the lowliest stones up through plants, animals, humans, angels, and finally to God himself. Humanity held a precious and unique place in the middle of this chain below the angels, but above the beasts, because humans alone possessed a rational soul that could know and love God. The cynosphere presented a terrifying crack in this neat structure. They were a living paradox, a challenge to the entire system. If a creature could exist that was neither fully beast nor fully man, where did it belong? Its very existence suggested that the boundaries of creation were far more fluid and mysterious than anyone had dared to imagine. This theological anxiety produced two strikingly different portrayals of the dog-headed men. In many accounts, they were the ultimate savages, embodying every fear the medieval European had about the unknown. They were described as monstrous, violent, and cannibalistic, living without law or religion, howling to communicate rather than speaking a civilized language. They represented the threat of a world without God's order, a descent back into pure animalistic brutality. They were a warning of what humanity could become if it lost its way, a symbol of the other that justified fear of foreign lands and peoples. Yet in a fascinating twist, other stories endowed the cynosphere with a profound, innate spirituality. The most famous example is the legend of Saint Christopher. In versions of his story popular in the Eastern Orthodox Church and in many medieval icons, Christopher is explicitly described as a cynosphere, a giant, dog-headed man from the land of the Canaanites. Initially a fearsome warrior, he seeks to serve the greatest king he can find. After discovering that his current master, a human king, fears the devil, and then that the devil fears Christ, Christopher converts to Christianity. During his baptism, he is miraculously transformed, his canine features melting away to reveal a handsome human face, a symbol of his newfound sanctity and the salvation of his soul. But in some tales, he retains his dog head even as a saint, becoming a powerful testament that a rational soul and the potential for divine grace could exist in the most unexpected of forms. This duality made the myth of the cynosphere one of the most complex in the medieval world. They were both monster and potential saint, a symbol of absolute otherness and a mirror for self-reflection. They forced a society that saw itself as the center of a God-ordained universe to confront a deeply unsettling possibility: that God's image might not look exclusively like them, and that His grace might extend to creatures they could barely comprehend. The dog-headed men were more than just a curiosity on a map. They were a theological test, a challenge to expand the boundaries of compassion and reconsider what it truly means to be human. If the cynosphere challenged medieval thinkers with the question of a soul within a beastly head, the Blemii presented a far more disorienting puzzle, a human form that had seemingly lost its head entirely. These legendary beings were described as headless humanoids, with their faces complete with eyes, nose, and mouth embedded directly in their chests. Said to inhabit the most remote and uncharted deserts of Africa or the farthest islands of Asia, the Blemii were not just exotic curiosities. They were walking violations of the natural order, living contradictions that provoked deep anxiety about what it meant to be human. The origins of this startling myth are as fascinating as the creature itself. Like many medieval marvels, the Blemii had classical roots. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote of headless men in Libya, and the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder placed them in the mountains of India, describing them as a savage race whose mouths and eyes were situated on their chest. These accounts, likely born from distorted traveler tales or misunderstood descriptions of tribes who wore large shoulder-mounted helmets or carried shields high on their bodies, were eagerly absorbed into the medieval worldview. They became a staple of the Hereford Mappa Mundi and other TO maps, where they were often illustrated lurking on the edges of the known world, literal margin dwellers in both geography and understanding. Beyond mere physical oddity, the Blemii struck at two profound medieval anxieties. The first was the integrity of the human body, which was believed to be a perfect, God-given vessel for the soul. The head was the seat of reason, the home of the five senses, the crowning glory of God's creation. A human without a head was therefore an ontological crisis, a being that physically could not house a rational soul in the manner God had designed. How could such a creature see the heavens to know God? How could it hear the word of Scripture? Its very form seemed to preclude it from salvation, placing it outside the divine plan in a deeply unsettling way. It represented a fear of physical deformity so extreme that it might render a person spiritually null. Secondly, the Blemmy embodied a deep anxiety about the foreign and the monstrous that lay beyond Christendom's borders. In a world with limited travel and communication, the edges of the map were spaces of pure imagination and fear. Populating these regions with such bizarre beings served a psychological purpose. It defined normality by illustrating its opposite. The civilized Christian European had a head in its proper place. The savage, pagan, other did not. This reinforced a sense of cultural and spiritual superiority, creating a clear divide between the us of the center and the them of the monstrous periphery. The Blemmy were a warning of what could happen to humanity when it strayed too far from God's light, a literal deformation of the divine image. Yet, in a remarkable twist found in some texts, the Blemmy were occasionally granted a degree of humanity that complicated this simple narrative. Sir John Mandeville's famous and fanciful Travels, a 14th century work that blended fact and fiction, described them not as mindless monsters but as a people with their own customs and a kind of crude society. This portrayal forced a subtle but important shift. It suggested that even a form so radically different might still possess a spark of reason, a capacity for community, and perhaps even a soul worthy of consideration. This flicker of empathy, however rare, shows that the medieval imagination was occasionally capable of wondering if the image of God could be imprinted on a chest as well as a head, challenging the very boundaries of compassion and inclusion. Yet beyond the unsettling margins of the map, where headless men and dog-headed tribes fueled anxieties of a world turned upside down, the medieval imagination also conjured a figure of perfect order and hope, a mighty Christian king reigning over a lost kingdom of impossible wonders. This is the enduring legend of Prester John, a myth that began as a whisper of a letter and grew into a driving force behind centuries of exploration. The story first ignited across Europe in the 12th century with the circulation of a mysterious document, a letter supposedly written by Prester John himself and addressed to the Byzantine emperor. It described his realm in lavish, breathtaking detail, a kingdom overflowing with riches where pepper grew like weeds and rivers of gold flowed through sands glittering with precious gems. But its true marvels were spiritual. The letter spoke of a fountain of youth that restored vitality to the aged, a mirror of justice that revealed all treachery, and a mystical Grail stone that provided light and sustenance to his people. Here was a land free from greed and falsehood, where giants and pygmies lived in harmony under the rule of their pious Christian monarch. This fantastical account did not emerge from a vacuum. It was born from a potent mixture of desire and geopolitical desperation. Western Europe in the High Middle Ages felt itself under siege. The crusades to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim powers were proving to be a brutal, grueling, and often futile endeavor. The idea that a powerful Christian ally, a priest-king of immense wealth and armies, existed beyond the Islamic world was intoxicating. He was the dreamed-of savior, a figure who could open a second front, crush the enemies of Christendom in a pincer movement, and restore Christian dominance. Prester John became the embodiment of this strategic hope, a symbol that they were not alone in their struggle, that a mighty champion was out there, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself and turn the tide of history. The location of this paradise was frustratingly fluid, shifting with the currents of exploration and rumor. Initially, Prester John's kingdom was placed squarely in the east, in the vast, unknown reaches of Asia. This was a land already steeped in mystery from the travels of Marco Polo, a place where anything seemed possible. When the Mongol Empire began its westward expansion, European rulers like Pope Innocent Roman IV actually sent emissaries eastward, partly in the genuine hope that the great Khan might be Prester John himself or at least a potential ally. The failure to find a Christian king in the east did not kill the myth, it simply caused it to migrate. As Portuguese caravels began probing down the coast of West Africa in the 15th century, the legend found a new home. The stories now said his kingdom lay in the heart of the continent, specifically in the wealthy Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, which was indeed a real and ancient Christian nation, though isolated from Europe for centuries. This new location fueled the Age of Discovery, giving explorers like Prince Henry the Navigator a sacred mission alongside their commercial goals: to find the legendary Prester John, make an alliance, and together outflank the Islamic world. The true power of the Prester John legend lies not in its geographical accuracy, but in what it reveals about the medieval psyche. It was a myth of reversal and wish fulfillment. In a Europe often divided by petty squabbles between kings and popes, Prester John's kingdom represented a utopian ideal of unity where spiritual and temporal power were perfectly balanced in one ruler. His title, Prester, meaning priest, and John, a kingly name, said it all. He was the ideal philosopher king, a ruler whose authority was directly sanctioned by God, ruling a land without poverty, sin, or war. Furthermore, his realm inverted the natural order that Europe knew. In his kingdom, it was the exotic East, or the dark continent of Africa, that was the center of piety, wisdom, and power, while Europe was the relative backwater. This was a profoundly humbling and yet inspiring thought. The myth ultimately sent a clear message that the center of God's grace was not necessarily where one expected it to be, and that paradise and powerful allies might still be found in the most unexpected corners of the world, waiting for those brave enough to go looking. Yet the very real hope of finding a mighty Christian ally like Prester John was often intertwined with a far more ancient and ethereal longing. The dream of discovering a literal paradise on earth, a sanctuary of perfection untouched by the fall of man. This was the powerful myth of the earthly paradise, a concept that wove together threads from the Bible, classical poetry, and travelers' tales into a vibrant tapestry of spiritual hope. Medieval Christians knew from the book of Genesis that the Garden of Eden was a real place created by God for Adam and Eve. But after their expulsion, its location was lost, hidden from sinful humanity by divine will. This did not stop them from believing it still existed somewhere, a pristine, walled garden flourishing in a remote corner of the world, a living relic of God's original, perfect creation. This paradise was almost always placed in the east, the direction of the rising sun, and a traditional symbol of birth, renewal, and divine origin. Medieval world maps, like the magnificent Hereford Mappa Mundi, often depicted it as a circular island at the very edge of Asia, separated from the rest of the world by a ring of impassable mountains or a wall of fire. It was described in breathtaking terms, a place where the sun always shone with a gentle light, where the air was perpetually fragrant with the scent of flowers and spices, and where the trees bore not just fruit but healing leaves and even gemstones. Most importantly, it was a land free from all the curses of the fall. There was no death, no sickness, no labor, no winter, and no sin. The earthly paradise was the ultimate symbol of innocence regained, a physical manifestation of the state of grace that humanity had lost but still yearned for. This vision was a beautiful fusion of scriptural and classical ideas. The biblical description of Eden with its 4 rivers and tree of life blended seamlessly with pagan visions of a golden age or the Elysian fields, a blissful afterlife for heroes found in Greek and Roman mythology. The medieval mind saw no contradiction in this. It was all evidence of a universal human memory of a lost perfection, fragments of the same divine truth expressed in different cultures. This synthesized paradise became a powerful motivator for both spiritual and physical exploration. For the devout, it was an object of pilgrimage by proxy, a place one could aspire to reach not with one's feet, but with one's heart through prayer and righteous living. Its existence was a promise that God's original, beautiful plan for the world was not completely erased, but merely waiting, hidden, for the day when it would be restored. For explorers and mapmakers, however, it was a tangible destination. The quest to find the earthly paradise fueled countless expeditions. When Columbus reached the verdant, unfamiliar coasts of the Americas, he was utterly convinced he had found the outer regions of Eden itself, citing the sweet air, lush vegetation, and what he believed were the fresh waters flowing from Paradise's 4 rivers as proof. This wasn't mere arrogance, it was the logical conclusion of a worldview that expected to find divine geography inscribed on the earth. The myth provided a framework for understanding the overwhelming newness of the world they were encountering, filtering the unknown through the comforting lens of a beloved and sacred story. Ultimately, the power of the earthly paradise myth lay in its ability to hold 2 ideas in perfect balance. It was both a real place on a map and a state of the soul. It offered a concrete goal for explorers while providing a profound metaphor for mystics. It reminded people that their spiritual home was not entirely in some distant heaven, but had once been, and perhaps in some way still was, a part of the very earth they walked on. This belief infused the physical world with a layer of sacred meaning, suggesting that every beautiful forest, every peaceful valley, and every flowing river was a faint echo of that original garden, a clue left by God to guide humanity's heart and sometimes its ships back home. But if the earthly paradise represented a lost state of perfection for all of humanity, another myth focused on a far more personal and visceral desire, the dream of recapturing the very essence of one's own vitality. This is the timeless legend of the Fountain of Youth, a spring of miraculous waters whose promise was so potent it launched expeditions, consumed the minds of alchemists, and became a powerful symbol of humanity's battle against time itself. The myth is deceptively simple. Somewhere in the world, hidden in a lush, inaccessible place, a natural fountain flows. Its waters possess the incredible power to reverse the aging process, to restore the gray hair of the elderly to its original color, to smooth wrinkled skin, to return the strength and vigor of youth, and perhaps even to grant immortality. This was not just a wish for a longer life, it was a fantasy of erasing life's toll, of hitting a divine reset button on the physical self. This legend found one of its most famous champions in the figure of Ponce de Leon, the Spanish explorer who supposedly searched for the fountain in the early 15th century in what is now Florida. While the historical accuracy of his specific quest is debated by scholars, the story itself is powerfully revealing. It shows how the Fountain of Youth myth was not a static folktale but an active force that helped drive the age of discovery. Explorers, armed with maps that placed the fountain in the distant, unexplored lands of the New World, embarked on dangerous voyages fueled by this tantalizing possibility. They believed that the exotic, uncharted territories of the Americas, with their strange new plants and animals, might also contain this ultimate secret, a natural wonder that could cheat death itself. The quest was a perfect fusion of burgeoning scientific curiosity and deep-seated mythological yearning. For the medieval alchemist, however, the search was more interior. They understood the Fountain of Youth not merely as a physical location, but as a profound spiritual allegory. The waters they sought were not found on any map, but were the aqua vitae or aqua permanens, the elusive water of life that was a key ingredient in the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. This was not literal water, but a symbolic, primordial substance representing purity, divine grace, and the untainted state of the soul before the fall. The process of spiritual alchemy involved a kind of internal baptism in this symbolic fountain. The seeker had to work to purify their own soul, to wash away the accumulated dirt of sin, worldly attachment, and egotism, the spiritual equivalents of aging and decay. By achieving this inner purification, the alchemist believed they could be reborn into a state of spiritual youth, connected directly to the divine source of all life and energy. In this sense, the fountain was always within, and its waters were the cleansing flow of divine love and wisdom. This dual interpretation, the literal and the spiritual, highlights a central tension in the medieval worldview. On one hand, there was a genuine belief that God's creation contained physical wonders and powerful remedies that could be discovered and harnessed. The natural world was a book written by God, and it was humanity's duty to read it and uncover its secrets. The search for a real fountain of youth was an extension of this belief. On the other hand, there was a parallel understanding that the physical world was also a mirror of the spiritual one. Every physical desire, like the wish to be young again, had a deeper spiritual counterpart. The true youth everyone sought was not just a flexible body, but a soul free from the weight of corruption, a heart full of the energy of faith and wonder. The fountain of youth, therefore, stood as a powerful symbol for redemption itself. The promise that no matter how far one had fallen or how weary one had become, there was always a possibility of cleansing, renewal, and a return to a state of grace. It was the medieval answer to the universal human fear of decline, offering a story that assured them that decay was not the final word, and that the source of everlasting life, whether in a hidden spring or a purified heart, was always waiting to be found. Yet for all its symbolic power as an object of quest, the Holy Grail needed a home, a sanctuary as mystical and guarded as the relic itself. This brings us to the legend of the Castle of the Holy Grail, a fortress not found on any earthly map, a place that existed in a liminal space between the physical world and the pure realm of spirit. Unlike the stone and timber castles of feudal Europe, this was no ordinary stronghold. It was described as a shimmering, almost ethereal structure, sometimes called Corbenic or the Castle of Souls, often appearing suddenly to a questing knight in a mist-shrouded valley or on the banks of a treacherous river, only to vanish just as mysteriously once he departed or failed its test. Its walls were said to be made of light as much as stone, and its halls were silent save for the haunting, angelic choirs that served the Grail. This was not a building one could simply storm or besiege. It was a destination for the soul, accessible only through spiritual readiness. The journey to this castle was the ultimate trial, a filter that ensured only a knight of perfect purity could enter. The path was never straight. It twisted and turned, leading the seeker through forests that symbolized confusion, across bridges that represented perilous choices, and past guardians who embodied their own inner doubts and sins. A knight like Sir Lancelot, for all his martial prowess and renown, was repeatedly denied full access because of his adulterous love for Queen Guinevere. He might catch a distant, blinding glimpse of the Grail within the castle halls, but the intensity of its divine light would strike him down, leaving him in a prolonged swoon, a physical manifestation of a soul not yet cleansed of its earthly attachments. The castle's gatekeepers were not armed sentries but spiritual conditions: humility, compassion, chastity, and unwavering faith. The drawbridge was lowered not by strength of arms but by strength of character. Within its walls, the castle itself became the final and most profound test. The centerpiece of this trial was the awe-inspiring Grail procession. The chosen knight, having finally attained entry, would be led into a great hall where he would witness a solemn parade of sacred objects. Young attendants would carry a bleeding lance, identified as the spear of destiny that pierced Christ's side. Others would follow with a silver platter that held the head of John the Baptist or fragments of the true cross. Finally, the Grail itself would be borne in, covered in a rich cloth, radiating a light that filled the entire castle with divine presence. Yet the knight's task was not to seize the relic. His test was one of silent empathy and compassionate inquiry. The myth tells us that the knight must ask a specific question to heal the land and fully reveal the Grail's power. Whom does the Grail serve? This question is the theological heart of the entire myth. It reverses the entire worldly notion of power and quest. The knight's long journey was not to gain a possession, but to achieve a state of understanding. The question reveals that the Grail is not a trophy to be won by a hero, but a divine vessel of grace that itself serves a higher purpose. To ask, whom does the Grail serve? Is to understand that true spiritual attainment lies not in acquisition, but in humble submission to God's will. It signifies that the knight has shifted his focus from his own glory to the divine mystery before him. The answer, of course, is that the Grail serves the Grail King, the wounded Fisher King who rules the castle, a ruler suffering from a grievous injury that mirrors the sickness of his kingdom. The knight's compassionate question is the key that unlocks the healing for both the king and the land, proving that his purity is not just of body but of intention. This magnificent castle, appearing and disappearing at the threshold of perception, perfectly represented the medieval understanding of divine revelation. It was not a truth that could be captured and owned. It was a grace that had to be received, and only when the soul was properly prepared to receive it. The castle's elusive nature mirrored the Christian belief that God is always present, yet his fullest presence is only revealed to those who have undertaken the difficult inner work of purification. It was a myth that offered immense comfort and challenge. It comforted by asserting that a place of perfect spiritual peace and connection did indeed exist. It challenged by making clear that the journey there was the most arduous undertaking imaginable, requiring a complete reorientation of the self away from pride and toward selfless love. The castle of the Holy Grail was more than a location. It was the destination of a successfully completed soul. Amidst the grandeur of Camelot and the celebrated fellowship of the Round Table, there existed one seat that radiated not honor, but an aura of silent, deadly judgment. This was the Siege Perilous, the Perilous Seat, an empty place reserved not by the decree of a king, but by a prophecy. It was not simply a vacant chair. It was a divine injunction carved in wood, a physical space held open for a spiritual event that had not yet come to pass. The myth declared that this seat was destined for one night, and one night only, the one who would ultimately achieve the quest for the Holy Grail. For any other who dared to sit in it, whether out of pride, curiosity, or simple ignorance, the consequence was not merely embarrassment, but instant and utter annihilation. This was no mere piece of furniture. It was a sacred instrument of divine selection, a lethal arbiter of worthiness in a world where spiritual status was the highest form of nobility. The power of the Siege Perilous lies in its stark embodiment of a core medieval concept, spiritual election. In the rigidly structured feudal world, your place at the table, literally and figuratively, was determined by birthright, conquest, or the appointment of your lord. Your seat was a mark of your earthly station. The Siege Perilous shattered this entire worldly system. It represented a hierarchy based not on bloodline or martial skill, but on a quality invisible to the human eye, spiritual purity. A knight could be the strongest, the bravest, the most loyal subject of King Arthur, and yet be utterly obliterated by this seat because his soul was not in the state of grace required for the ultimate divine encounter. It was a terrifying equalizer, a constant, silent reminder to the proud knights of the Round Table that all their earthly renown meant nothing in the face of a celestial standard they could not control. The empty space at the table was a sermon in wood, preaching that true greatness was conferred by God alone, and that this grace could not be claimed, only humbly received. This made the seat the ultimate defense against the sin of spiritual presumption, the arrogant belief that one could seize holiness through force of will or the weight of one's accomplishments. The myth served as a dire warning against the human tendency to attempt to shortcut the arduous process of inner transformation. To sit in the Siege Perilous without being its destined occupant was the ultimate act of religious hubris. It was to declare oneself worthy of a glory that could only be earned through a lifetime of self-abnegation and moral perfection. The deadly consequence was not portrayed as a punishment from a vengeful god, but as the natural, inevitable result of a profound metaphysical mismatch. A soul marred by sin and ego coming into direct, unprepared contact with a vessel of pure, concentrated divine grace would simply be unmade, like a leaf tossed into a forge. The seat did not actively kill the unworthy knight. His own unworthiness upon touching the seat's sacred purpose became the instrument of his own destruction. The destined occupant, of course, was Sir Galahad, the knight often depicted as the paragon of virginity and piety, the son of Lancelot whose purity remained untainted by the world. His successful seating in the Siege Perilous is the climax of his spiritual journey, the moment his internal state is finally and publicly ratified by a divine sign. When he takes his place, the seat does not destroy him. Instead, his presence completes the circle, making the Round Table whole for the first time and inaugurating the Grail quest itself. His achievement shows that the seat's peril was never about arbitrary danger, but about perfect alignment. For Galahad, sitting down was not an act of presumption but one of fulfillment, the natural ending of a life lived in harmony with a divine calling. In the end, the myth of the Siege Perilous is one of the most psychologically astute in the Arthurian cycle. It understands that the quest for the sacred is not a game. It acknowledges that there are states of being that are not just better but fundamentally different, and that crossing that threshold unprepared is not a simple failure but a cosmic catastrophe. The empty chair at Camelot was a permanent testament to the fact that some things in heaven and earth are reserved, not to exclude, but to honor the sacredness of the destination by demanding that the traveler become worthy of the journey. It was a guardian of the threshold, ensuring that only a soul refined by grace could step into the presence of a mystery that would utterly consume anything less. At the heart of the Grail legend, surrounded by the chivalric quests of Arthur's knights, lies a mystery far more intimate and profound: the tale of the Fisher King. He is the wounded guardian, the keeper of the Grail who resides in its shimmering castle, yet he is also its prisoner. His name derives from his primary activity. Too injured to ride, hunt, or wage war, he can only fish from a small boat on the river near his castle, a quiet and melancholy pastime for a once great king. His wound, often described as a grievous injury to the thighs or groin, is more than a physical ailment. It is a symbol of a deep spiritual and generative paralysis. He cannot die, but he cannot truly live, existing in a state of perpetual suffering that is mystically and terribly reflected in the world around him. His personal torment becomes a national catastrophe, for the kingdom he rules is as wounded as he is. The fields lie fallow and barren, the rivers provide no fish, the trees bear no fruit, and the people live in a state of collective despair. This symbiotic connection between the ruler and his land is a powerful medieval concept known as the wasteland. It visualizes the belief that the moral and spiritual health of a leader directly influences the fertility and fortune of the realm. A king who is whole, just, and in a state of grace will preside over a prosperous and peaceful land, but a king who is corrupted, sinful, or wounded ushers in blight, drought, and famine. The Fisher King's suffering is not a private matter, it is a cosmological event. This myth offers a complex meditation on the nature of spiritual leadership and the burden of sovereignty. The king is not an evil tyrant, he is a good man trapped in an endless cycle of pain. He possesses the ultimate object of spiritual sustenance, the Holy Grail, yet he cannot access its healing power for himself. He is the gatekeeper of a divine mystery from which he is personally estranged, a paradox that speaks volumes about the medieval understanding of grace. One could be surrounded by the symbols of faith, even be their appointed guardian, and yet remain disconnected from their transformative power due to an unhealed wound within. His impotence is both physical and symbolic, representing a failure of life-giving energy and creative power. He cannot produce an heir, he cannot lead his people, and he cannot make the land flourish. His castle, for all its splendor, becomes a gilded cage of stagnation, and his guardianship of the Grail becomes a perpetual reminder of the wholeness he has lost. The resolution to this tragic impasse arrives not through a mighty battle or a magical potion, but through a simple, compassionate act of communication. The healing of the king and his kingdom does not require the questing knight to perform a feat of strength, but to achieve a feat of empathy. After witnessing the solemn Grail procession within the castle, the parade of the bleeding lance, the silver platters, and the veiled Grail itself, the knight's ultimate task is not to grab the relic but to ask a specific, heartfelt question. In the earliest versions of the story, the knight Percival remains silent, too schooled in the courtly manners that forbid speaking out of turn. His failure to ask condemns the king to another year of agony. He learns that his quest is not for a thing but for understanding. When he finally succeeds, or when the pure knight Galahad arrives, the question is asked: whom does the Grail serve? This question is the key that unlocks the entire myth. It is a moment of profound spiritual intelligence that reverses the normal order of power. The knight does not ask, "What is the Grail?" or "How can I possess it?" Instead, he asks whom it serves, acknowledging that this divine vessel is not a trophy to be won, but an instrument of a higher will. The question shifts the focus from the knight's own quest for glory to the suffering of the king and the mystery before him. It is an act of selfless curiosity and compassion. The answer, as revealed in the legends, is that the Grail serves the Grail King himself. The act of asking the question demonstrates that the knight has achieved the necessary spiritual maturity. He has moved beyond seeking personal honor and has instead become a channel for divine grace. His empathetic inquiry is the catalyst that breaks the curse, allowing the king to be healed and the land to be restored to fertility. The wasteland blooms once more, not because a hero has claimed a prize, but because a soul has finally asked the right question in the right spirit. In this, the myth of the Fisher King becomes a powerful allegory for redemption through proper understanding. It suggests that healing for ourselves, for our leaders, and for our world often begins not with force, but with a sincere and insightful question that acknowledges a deeper truth. The king's wound is healed by an act of intellectual and emotional connection, not by a physical medicine. This reflects a medieval belief that many forms of suffering, especially spiritual malaise, are rooted in a failure of perception or a silence that needs to be broken. The story assures us that redemption is always possible, but it requires the arrival of one who can see beyond the surface, who can perceive the connection between the ruler's pain and the world's decay, and who has the courage to speak a word of compassion that activates the grace already present in the world. The Grail was always there in the castle, just as divine grace is always available, but it required the perfect question to make its healing power manifest for all. Leaving behind the grand quests of knights and the divine geometry of angelic choirs, we arrive at a legend far more humble in its setting, yet utterly bone-chilling in its implications. It is the 12th century in the small village of Woolpit in Suffolk, England. The harvest is underway and villagers are working at the edge of pits dug to trap wolves, the wolf pits that give the village its name. It is here, amidst the mundane toil of rural life, that something impossible occurs. From one of these dark, earthy trenches, two children emerge, a boy and a girl. They are dressed in strange, unfamiliar clothing, but most shockingly of all, their skin is a vivid, unmistakable shade of green. The villagers, astonished and fearful, bring the disoriented children to the home of the local landowner, Sir Richard de Calne. The children are offered all manner of food, but they refuse to eat, seemingly on the verge of starvation yet repulsed by the offerings. They are crying, speaking to each other in a language that is utterly foreign to the ears of the Suffolk locals, a tongue that sounds like no language from any known land. They are terrified, strangers in every sense of the word, trapped in a world whose very sunlight seems painful to them. according to the two most detailed chroniclers of the event, William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, it is only when fresh beanstalks, still green and with their pods, are brought before them that the children show any interest. They do not know how to open the pods, so a villager shows them. They devour the raw, green beans inside, and for some time this is the only sustenance they will accept. Eventually, as they begin to adjust to their new world, their green coloration slowly fades. They are baptized into the Christian faith, but tragedy strikes when the young boy, always the weaker and more melancholic of the two, sickens and dies. The girl, however, survives, learns to eat a wider variety of foods, and even masters the English language. It is from her that the incredible story of their origin is finally pieced together. She explains that they come from a land she calls St. Martin's Land, a place of perpetual twilight where all the people are green like they were, and where the sun never shines brightly. She describes a vast, luminous country on the other side of a broad river, a land of soft, constant radiance. She and her brother were tending their father's flocks when they heard a loud, haunting noise. They followed the sound into a cavern, and after wandering in darkness, they were suddenly blinded by the intense, unbearable brightness of our sun, stumbling out of the wolf pit where the villagers found them. This account, recorded by serious medieval historians, is not presented as a fantastical fable, but as a factual report of a genuine mystery. For modern minds, it invites a host of rational explanations. Were the children suffering from hypochromic anemia, a condition often caused by malnutrition which can give the skin a greenish pallor? Were they Flemish orphans displaced by the violent persecution of Flemish immigrants in that region, speaking a Germanic language that would have sounded alien to the English-speaking locals, and perhaps dressed in unfamiliar Flemish clothing? Could their story of a twilight land be a child's confused memory of a dark, underground refuge or a smoke-filled landscape? But for the medieval worldview, the green children of Woolpit were not a medical or political puzzle. They were living, breathing proof of a profound spiritual truth. They were evidence that the world was far stranger and more layered than it appeared. Their story resonated with deep-seated beliefs in the permeability of the universe. This was an era that fervently believed in otherworldly realms that existed just alongside our own, the land of the fairies, the kingdom of Prester John, the earthly paradise. These were not always thought to be in some distant continent, but often just a step away, hidden behind a mist at the bottom of a hill or accessible through a cave. The children's emergence from a pit was significant. The earth itself was seen as a veil separating our world from these subterranean or parallel dimensions. Their green coloration was the most potent symbol of all. In medieval symbolism, the color green was deeply ambivalent. It was the color of life, of nature, of the vibrant and unstoppable force of growth. But it was also the color of decay, of mildew, of things that were not quite right. Most importantly, green was the color most frequently associated with the fairy folk and the inhabitants of the other world. The children's green skin was not an illness to the medieval mind. It was a badge of origin, a clear sign that they were not of this sun-drenched mortal realm. They were visitors from the land of twilight, from a place where the normal rules of life and nature were fundamentally different. Their inability to eat anything but green beans further cemented this. It suggested that they were creatures of sympathy and connection, that they could only consume food that resonated with their own essential green nature. Their initial pain from our sunlight was the pain of a creature of gloom suddenly exposed to the harsh light of divine truth and common reality. Their gradual loss of green hue and their eventual baptism into Christianity completed a powerful narrative arc for a medieval audience. It was the story of the other world being saved by the Christian world. These strange, supernatural beings were brought into the light of God, their pagan greenness washed away by the waters of baptism and the bread of the Eucharist, fully integrated into the human and Christian fold. The girl's survival and assimilation showed that even the most alien and mysterious of beings could be redeemed by the grace of God and the embrace of the Church. The Green Children of Woolpit were the ultimate missionary story, a tale that confirmed the supremacy of the Christian world while simultaneously validating the existence of the wondrous, terrifying, and mysterious dimensions that lay just beyond the edge of the village fields. While King Arthur's knights quested across the familiar landscapes of Britain and the Fisher King waited in his mystical castle, another legendary figure sought his promised land not on solid ground, but across the vast, terrifying, and unknown expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. This is the myth of Saint Brendan the Navigator, a 6th century Irish monk whose incredible voyage became one of the most cherished and influential tales of the Middle Ages. His story, detailed in the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, is not a simple travelogue. It is a profound spiritual allegory disguised as a seafaring adventure, a story that convinced generations of Europeans that paradise was not just east but also west waiting beyond the horizon. The voyage begins with a call to pilgrimage. Brendan, an abbot known for his piety, is visited by another monk who tells him of a distant land far to the west, a paradise promised to the saints overflowing with every delight. This terra promissa, or promised land of the saints, becomes Brendan's ultimate destination. He and a small crew of devout monks construct a traditional Irish caroga, a boat made of animal hide stretched over a wooden frame, a vessel seemingly frail against the might of the open ocean. This choice of boat is itself deeply symbolic. Their journey would not be powered by technological might, but by faith alone. They cast off from the Irish coast, entrusting their fate entirely to divine providence, setting out into what medieval cartographers called the Mare Tenebrosum, the Sea of Darkness. What follows is a 7-year odyssey that reads like a divine travel guide to a miraculously transformed Atlantic. Brendan and his monks do not simply sail on empty water. They encounter a series of spectacular and impossible islands, each one a stop on their spiritual journey. They land on an island that turns out to be the back of a gigantic sea monster named Jasconius, mistaking it for solid land until they light a fire and the creature awakens. This episode serves as a warning against mistaking the temporal for the eternal, a lesson in spiritual discernment. They visit the island of Sheep, a place of simple, God-provided sustenance, and the paradise of birds, where a flock of white birds sings psalms and reveals themselves to be fallen angels who retained a portion of God's grace. Each island is a station on their path, offering a specific lesson about faith, temptation, and the nature of God's creation. The most famous of these encounters is their celebration of Easter on what appears to be a barren rock island. As the monks begin their liturgy, the island suddenly shudders and moves. They have inadvertently landed on the back of another colossal creature, this one known as the great fish or whale named Aspidochelone, a beast so huge that sand and vegetation had gathered on its back over centuries, creating the illusion of an island. The lesson is clear and terrifying. Even the most stable-seeming foundations in the physical world can be an illusion. True stability can only be found in the unwavering constancy of God, not in the shifting nature of the earthly realm. Throughout their journey, the natural world itself becomes a participant in their liturgy. The sea provides for them. Giant pillars of crystal rise from the waves, and they are guided by a mysterious, ever-burning lamp that requires no oil. The Atlantic Ocean in the Navigatio is not a void to be crossed, but a sacred geography, a world charged with divine meaning where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural are utterly dissolved. This vision offered medieval readers a comforting and wondrous model of the universe, one in which God's wonders were not confined to the Holy Land but were woven into the very fabric of the entire world, even its most frightening and unexplored corners. The lasting power of St. Brendan's myth, however, lies in its breathtaking fusion of faith and exploration. It perfectly captures the medieval mindset that saw no contradiction between religious devotion and the desire to discover new lands. For Brendan, every mile sailed was a mile prayed. The voyage was his monastery, the ocean his cloister. His quest was the ultimate expression of peregrinatio pro Christo, a voluntary exile for Christ, where the destination was less important than the act of surrendering oneself completely to God's will, even if it meant sailing off the edge of the known world. This story had a very real and tangible impact on history. Medieval mapmakers, taking the Navigatio as a semi-historical account, began placing St. Brendan's Island on their charts of the Atlantic Ocean. For centuries, it was a cartographic fixture, a real destination that explorers sought. Many, including Christopher Columbus, studied the legend and believed that the promised land of the saints might be a real place, perhaps the outer edges of Asia or a previously unknown continent. The myth of St. Brendan didn't just inspire prayer, it helped fuel the age of discovery, giving navigators a spiritual and geographical reason to brave the terrifying emptiness of the Western Sea. It stands as a timeless testament to the human spirit, a blend of unwavering faith and unquenchable curiosity, a belief that the greatest wonders are always waiting just beyond the next wave for those with the courage to sail toward them. Yet even a voyage as miraculous as St. Brendan's, charting a sacred geography across the Western Sea, pales before a legend that confronts the very nature of time itself, the profound and deeply moving myth of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. Imagine 7 young Christian men, noble youths living in the mid-3rd century under the harsh persecution of the Roman Emperor Decius. Refusing to renounce their faith and offer sacrifices to the empire's pagan gods, they choose to hide in a vast cave on the outskirts of the city of Ephesus. Their hiding place is discovered. The emperor, enraged by their defiance, orders the cave's entrance to be sealed with massive stones, entombing them alive as a grim example to other would-be believers. And here, the historical record of their martyrdom would typically end. But for these 7 youths, it was merely the beginning of a divine miracle that would stretch across centuries. They did not perish in that dark, airless prison. Instead, they fell into a deep, divinely ordained slumber, a state of suspended animation where time lost all meaning. Their bodies were preserved, their spirits held in a sacred pause, while the world outside the sealed entrance continued its relentless march forward. The Roman Empire itself would undergo a transformation they could never have dreamed of. Persecution gave way to toleration under Emperor Constantine, and then, under Emperor Theodosius II nearly 200 years later, Christianity was not just tolerated but had become the official state religion of the entire empire. The very faith for which they were being executed had now triumphed. The miracle of their awakening is where the legend finds its most powerful resonance. A landowner, perhaps needing stone for construction, orders his workers to unseal the cave entrance. As sunlight pours into the cavern for the first time in generations, the 7 youths naturally stir, believing they have slept only a single night. One of them, Malchus, is sent back into the city to secretly buy bread, still clutching the ancient coins from the time of Decius, but the city he enters is utterly unrecognizable. He sees crosses prominently displayed on public buildings, hears people freely invoking the name of Christ in the marketplace, and is bewildered by the strange new architecture. When he tries to pay for bread with his centuries-old coin, he is accused of having discovered a hidden ancient treasure. The commotion draws the attention of the city's bishop and the governor, to whom Malchus frantically tells his story. They follow him back to the cave and witness the miraculous truth for themselves. The 7 sleepers, having borne witness to the truth of the resurrection through their own miraculous return to life, then peacefully die, giving praise to God, their souls finally released to heaven after their long earthly vigil. This story, which spread from its Greek origins to be embraced and celebrated in both the Christian and Islamic traditions, where they are known as the people of the cave, or a letter 1 E6 3 letter 1 E2 5 a macron b al-Kaf in the Quran, tackles one of the most profound and comforting concepts in medieval spirituality: divine suspension. The sleepers were not merely saved from death, they were saved through time. Their long rest was an act of God placing them in a sacred holding pattern, preserving them like a holy relic until the world was ready to receive their testimony. They served as living proof that God's timeline is not our own, that His protection can operate on a scale that dwarfs human understanding. In an era of short, brutal lives where a plague or a famine could wipe out a village in a season, the story was a powerful consolation. It assured believers that what seemed like an endless period of suffering or waiting could, in God's grand design, be merely a single night's sleep before a glorious dawn. Their bodies, untouched by decay for centuries, were a metaphor for the soul's own preservation through the long night of earthly trial. Furthermore, the myth explored the mysterious, fluid nature of time in spiritual context. Their experience in the cave was a form of holy time, a duration measured not by the sun or the turning of the seasons, but by the will of the divine. They awoke not as old men, but exactly as they were when they entered, their youth preserved along with their faith. This spoke to a medieval belief that time spent in God's grace operated by different rules, that a life devoted to prayer and faith was in a sense timeless. The moment of their awakening, when the 7th century bishop meets the 3rd century youths, creates a breathtaking collision of timelines, a tangible demonstration that the community of saints transcends the centuries. The faithful of the past were not gone, they were merely sleeping, waiting to be reunited with the faithful of the present in the eternal now of God's kingdom. The 7 sleepers became the ultimate symbol of hope, a promise that no matter how dark the world seems, how long the persecution lasts, or how deeply the cave is sealed, divine providence is always keeping watch, and a new morning of unexpected grace is always waiting to break. But if the peaceful slumber of the 7 sleepers represented divine protection, the medieval imagination also conjured a far more terrifying inversion of the night, a gathering not of holy rest but of unholy revelry. This is the chilling myth of the witches' Sabbath, a narrative that transformed the darkness into a theater of diabolical conspiracy and turned folk superstitions into a deadly engine of persecution. Unlike the personal hauntings of a ghost or the solitary curse of a witch, the Sabbath was a collective nightmare, a vision of an organized, secret society dedicated to the systematic overthrow of the divine order. It was the ultimate expression of a deeply anxious mindset that saw hidden networks of evil lurking behind every misfortune, a belief that would cast a long and bloody shadow across Europe. The imagined ritual of the Sabbath was a meticulously detailed and grotesque inversion of the Catholic Mass, a dark parody designed to provoke maximum horror in a devout society. The gathering was said to begin with witches anointing their bodies with a magical flying ointment, a blasphemous concoction often said to be made from the fat of unbaptized babies that allowed them to soar through the night sky on broomsticks, pokers, or even transformed animals to a remote location, often a mountain peak or a deep forest clearing. There they would be greeted by the devil himself, who often appeared not as a majestic figure of power, but as a monstrous, cold, and sometimes pathetic creature, a giant black goat, a man with a hideous bestial face, or a figure whose touch was of ice. The witches would then pay him homage by kissing his backside, the osculum infam or shameful kiss, a direct and disgusting mockery of the act of kissing a bishop's ring or a holy relic. This act of fealty opened the ceremonies, which proceeded to systematically desecrate every sacred pillar of medieval life. Instead of a Eucharistic feast, the witches would partake in a foul banquet of rotting and tasteless food, often seasoned with saltless bread and wine that turned to vinegar. Instead of chanting psalms, they would sing blasphemous hymns praising their dark lord. The centerpiece of the gathering was often a wild, chaotic dance that devolved into an orgiastic free-for-all, breaking all societal laws of chastity and marriage. This was often followed by the plotting of maleficium, the working of harmful magic, Witches would compare notes on how to blight crops, sour milk, kill livestock, and induce illness in their neighbors, receiving new recipes for poison and instructions for crafting curses from the devil himself. The entire event was a complete renunciation of the Christian world, a celebration of everything it deemed sinful and taboo, serving as powerful proof to inquisitors that witchcraft was not just a local nuisance but an organized heresy, a spiritual treason that demanded the most severe response. This terrifying myth did not emerge from a vacuum. It was a potent fusion of two powerful streams, ancient folk belief and escalating ecclesiastical fear. For centuries, European folklore had spoken of the wilders here, the wild hunt, or of night-roaming spirits like the Italian Benandanti or the Hungarian Toltos people, whose spirits were believed to leave their bodies at night to battle evil spirits and ensure a good harvest. These folk traditions often involved trance-like states and out-of-body experiences, which church authorities, increasingly obsessed with rooting out heresy, began to reinterpret. They took these vague shamanistic beliefs and forcefully recast them within a rigid Christian framework of sin and demonology. The spirit journeys became flights to a satanic meeting. The battles for fertility became plots to spread blight. The community protectors became enemies of all mankind. The creation and propagation of the Sabbath myth were largely driven from the top down by educated theologians and inquisitors. Its most detailed descriptions come not from the confessions of simple village healers, but from the leading questions and tortured elaborations of their interrogators, guided by manuals like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. For the Church, the concept of the Sabbath was terrifyingly useful. It transformed isolated acts of maleficium, which could often be explained by personal grudges or simple misfortune, into evidence of a vast conspiratorial network. This justified the expansion of their judicial power and the use of extreme torture to extract the names of other participants, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of fear and accusation. A single old woman accused of cursing a farmer's cow could, under torture, be made to reveal a secret gathering of dozens from neighboring villages, unleashing a wave of paranoia that could consume an entire region. The impact of this myth on real human lives was catastrophic. It provided the ideological blueprint for the great witch hunts that swept across Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries, leading to the trial and execution of tens of thousands of people, predominantly women. The Sabbath became a standard set of questions in every interrogation, a script that the accused were forced to confirm. It created a shared language of fear that allowed a single panic in one village to ignite a continent-wide crisis. Beyond the physical torture and death, the myth bred a deep and pervasive spiritual anxiety. It taught people that their neighbors, especially those who are old, poor, female, or simply eccentric, might be secret agents of Satan, that the darkness was not empty but teeming with invisible threats, and that the most profound evil was not out in the wilderness but hidden in plain sight, waiting for the cover of night to reveal its true face. The witch's Sabbath stands as one of the most destructive myths ever conceived, a stark reminder of how the human need to explain misfortune, when weaponized by fear and authority, can conjure monsters far more real and deadly than any that fly on broomsticks. Yet for all the collective terror of the witch's Sabbath and its vast nocturnal conspiracies, some of the most potent and feared magic in the medieval world was believed to spring from a single, grisly object, a tool of such specific and chilling power that it turned the severed limb of a criminal into a master key for thieves. This is the dark and macabre legend of the Hand of Glory, a myth that perfectly encapsulates the medieval belief in the latent power residing in the human body, especially one that had met a violent and judicial end. The recipe for creating this fearsome talisman was as precise as it was grotesque. It required the left hand of a murderer who had been hanged on the gibbet, severed from the body while the corpse still swung from the chains. The hand would then be tightly wrapped in a shroud, pickled in a jar with salt, pepper, and urine for a fortnight, and finally dried in the sun, or more commonly, cured in an oven with a foul mixture of herbs like vervain and aconite. Once the gruesome preservation process was complete, the hand was transformed into a horrific candlestick. The fingers were clenched closed, save for one, which was extended to act as a wick. This wick was not made of simple cotton. It was crafted from the dead man's own hair, or from a special candle-making fat rendered from the corpse of the same hanged criminal, or, in some versions, from the fat of an unbaptized infant. When lit, this candle was said to emit a strange, phosphorescent, and unnatural light that possessed two extraordinary properties. First, it would cast anyone in its vicinity into a deep, unwakeable sleep, rendering them completely helpless. Second, and most crucially for its intended users, it would force any locked door or mechanism to spring open, making it the ultimate tool for burglars and outlaws. The power of this myth lies in its shocking combination of sacred and profane symbolism. The hand itself, taken from a man who had died by the rope, was an object of ultimate transgression. The gallows stood at a powerful crossroads in the medieval mind. It was a place of legal justice, but also a liminal space between earth and heaven, a point of violent death where the soul's fate was decided. Body parts from such a location were thought to be charged with a strange, residual power. The criminal, by his very act and his punishment, had been pushed outside the boundaries of normal society and normal spiritual laws, and his physical remains were believed to retain a trace of that transgressive energy, a power that could be harnessed by those brave or damned enough to try. Furthermore, the ritual of its creation was a dark, blasphemous parody of Christian sacramentals. The pickling process mirrored the preservation of saints' relics, the wrapping in a shroud echoed the burial rites of the faithful, and the candle itself was a wicked inversion of the blessed candles used in church ceremony to ward off evil and illuminate divine truth. The hand of glory did the opposite. It spread a light of spiritual darkness. It induced a slumber of vulnerability rather than peaceful rest, and it opened doors not to salvation but to sin. It represented a complete hijacking of spiritual power for criminal, selfish ends, making it one of the most feared and potent symbols of malevolent magic. This belief was so deeply ingrained that well into the 18th and 19th centuries, there are accounts of people in rural England and France taking precautions against it. Old cottage doors in Yorkshire sometimes had a special hole bored through them, not for a key, but so a homeowner could peer through to check if a glowing hand was being used on the other side before unbolting the lock. The myth persisted because it addressed a very real human fear, the vulnerability of the home at night. In an era without electric lights or reliable police forces, the idea that a criminal could possess a supernatural object that neutralized all your defenses and left your family in a magical coma was the ultimate violation. The Hand of Glory was more than a story. It was a crystallization of the terror of being utterly powerless, a dark confirmation that the most dangerous threats were those that could not be fought with ordinary strength or locks alone. And so we arrive at the final and perhaps most personally transformative of our 35 legendary myths, a system not of a single relic or creature, but of 78 illustrated cards that form a complete map of the human soul's journey. This is the myth of the Taros Major Arcana, a story that begins not in mystical temples, but in the lively, smoke-filled gaming halls of 15th century Italy and France. Originally, these beautifully painted cards were simply a deck for playing a trick-taking game called tarocchi, much like modern bridge. The 22 special trump cards, the Triumphi or Triumphs, featured allegorical figures like the Emperor, the Pope, and virtues like justice, acting as a playful mirror to the hierarchical feudal society that ordered the medieval world. They were lavish status symbols for the nobility, their imagery drawn from the public festivals and triumphal parades that were the pageantry of the age. Yet somehow, this deck of playing cards underwent a miraculous metamorphosis, slowly transforming over centuries into one of the Western world's most intricate and enduring tools for spiritual contemplation. The shift began when philosophers, mystics, and occultists of the 18th and 19th centuries looked at these enigmatic images and saw something far deeper than a game. They perceived in the 22 cards of the major arcana a profound narrative sequence, a symbolic representation of the fool's journey, a metaphor for every soul's path from innocence to enlightenment. Each card became a chapter in a sacred text without words, a dense fusion of Christian iconography, classical mythology, and ancient esoteric wisdom from Kabbalistic, alchemical, and astrological traditions, all synthesized into a universal language of symbols. Consider the powerful imagery woven into these cards. The Pope became the Hierophant, a bridge between the divine and the faithful, teaching sacred mysteries. The Papess evolved into the High Priestess, seated between the pillars of Bos and Jachin from Solomon's temple, holding a scroll of secret knowledge on her lap, representing intuitive wisdom and the unconscious mind. The Wheel of Fortune card captures the medieval worldview perfectly, a blindfolded goddess turning a wheel that raises kings up and casts them down, a stark reminder of fate's unpredictability and the temporal world's fleeting nature, a direct echo of the myth of the three living and the three dead. The Devil card, often depicted as a half-human, half-goat figure reminiscent of Baphomet, channels all the fears of demonic pacts and earthly temptation that fueled the witch trials, representing the bondage of materialism and base desires. The true genius of the tarot as a modern myth lies in its structure as a spiritual journey. The sequence tells a story. It begins with the Fool, numbered 0, a figure of pure potential, setting off on his path with all the innocence and cluelessness of a seeker at the start of an adventure. He then encounters a series of archetypal forces and lessons: the Magician, willpower and resourcefulness; the Empress, divine feminine, nurturing abundance; the Emperor, structure and authority; the Lover's, choice and moral alignment; the Chariot, willpower overcoming conflict. The journey's middle is marked by a profound crisis with the Death card, which rarely signifies physical death but rather necessary, painful endings and transformation, the ultimate surrender of the old self. This leads to a higher stage of development: temperance, balance and alchemical blending; the Devil facing one's shadows; the Tower, sudden, disruptive revelation that shatters false paradigms; the Star, hope and healing; the Moon, navigating illusion and fear; and finally the Sun, clarity, joy and vitality. The journey culminates in Judgment, a card of resurrection and answered calling, and concludes with the World, representing integration, completion and cosmic understanding. This system became a powerful myth because it externalized the internal. It gave people a tangible, visual framework to project their own struggles, choices, and transformations onto. A person grappling with a difficult decision could see themselves in the Lover's card. Someone undergoing a painful but necessary life change could find solace and meaning in the narrative of the Death card. The tarot didn't predict a fixed future. It offered a mirror to the present, reflecting the archetypal energies at play in one's life and the potential paths of spiritual growth that lay ahead. It served the same function as the best medieval myths. It made the abstract complexities of the human condition concrete, relatable, and navigable. It was a portable cathedral of symbols, a personal grail castle that anyone could enter with a simple question and an open mind, providing a structure to understand their own unique place within the timeless spiritual mysteries of existence. And so our journey through these 35 legendary myths draws to a close, not as an ending, but as an invitation to look back across the vast and vibrant landscape we've traversed together. From the quest for the Holy Grail to the chilling rituals of the witch's Sabbath, from the divine geometry of the angelic hierarchy to the earthy magic of the mandrake root, these stories form a magnificent tapestry woven by the medieval mind in its bold attempt to map the unmappable. They were not mere fantasies or simple superstitions. They were a profound philosophical and spiritual project, a way of using narrative and symbol to confront the great mysteries of existence that logic alone could never fully explain. What emerges so powerfully from these tales is a world where every rock, river, and creature was potentially alive with meaning. The medieval mind did not draw a firm line between the physical and the spiritual. A unicorn was both a real animal one might hope to encounter and a dazzling symbol of Christ's incarnation. The angelic hierarchy was both a theological concept and a literal, functioning celestial government. This was a world charged with significance, where the supernatural was not a distant possibility, but an intimate and ever-present layer of reality. These myths were the language through which people explored fundamental human questions that are as urgent today as they were 1,000 years ago. What is the nature of good and evil? Is there a purpose to our suffering? What awaits us after death? How can we connect with the divine? The answers they fashioned were not dry academic treatises, but living, breathing stories filled with peril, wonder, and awe, stories that offered comfort, provided warning, and forged a sense of meaning in a world that could often feel random and frightening. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of these myths is how they continue to resonate deep within us. The questing beast still mirrors our own restless search for purpose in a noisy world. The Fisher King's wound still speaks to the connection between our inner brokenness and the health of our communities. The Phoenix's cycle of destruction and rebirth still offers a powerful metaphor for our own capacity to overcome personal tragedy and emerge transformed. These stories endure because they are not about a distant, forgotten people. They are about us. They tap into universal archetypes and eternal dilemmas, reminding us that the human heart, in its essentials, has not changed. We still yearn for redemption, we still fear the unknown, and we still seek signs of a hidden order behind the chaos of everyday life. Now we turn the question over to you. Which of these 35 myths captured your imagination most powerfully? Did the solemn duty of the Grail Guardian speak to you, or the terrifying freedom of the wild hunt? Are you drawn to the structured faith of the angelic orders, or the earthy, perilous magic of the Hand of Glory? What do these ancient stories reveal to you about your own spiritual questions and yearnings? Share your thoughts and your own favorite medieval mysteries in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation and keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for joining this exploration of the shadows and light of a world where the unseen felt profoundly real. Until our next journey into the mysteries of the past, may your own quest